Hey there, and welcome back. If you're getting cozy right now, maybe the lights are low, maybe you've pulled a blanket up around you, maybe there's a cup of something warm nearby. Good. Stay where you are. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Tonight we are going to spend a long, slow evening in a kind of room. The room is the Great Hall of Windsor Castle, on a December evening in the year 1358. The room is very large, perhaps 100 feet long, 40 feet wide, with a high arched timber roof rising 40 feet above the stone-flagged floor. It is lit, on the evening we are interested in, by perhaps 200 candles in tall iron candelabra, and by the great open fire that is burning in the central hearth in the middle of the floor. The smoke from the fire rises, in the way of the period, up to a louvre in the centre of the roof and out into the cold December night above. The walls of the hall are hung with great tapestries, biblical scenes, hunting scenes, the heraldic devices of the Plantagenet kings. Long oak tables run down both sides of the hall, with wooden benches arranged behind them. At the far end of the hall, on a raised wooden platform, a dais stands the great high table, with a group of high-backed wooden chairs arranged behind it, a great cloth of gold spread across it, and the arrangement of silver-gilt cups and gold salt cellars and silver dishes that the period associated with the absolute height of royal entertainment. We are about to spend an entire evening at this hall. We are going to watch the guests arrive. We are going to see them seated, according to the protocols of the period. We are going to watch the food brought in, course by course, with all the theatrical ritual that the medieval royal feast had developed by the middle of the 14th century. We are going to listen to the music. We are going to hear the conversations. We are going to be there, in our imagination, until the candles are snuffed in the dark hours of the early morning, and the last of the guests are escorted to their lodgings through the cold December air of the castle courtyards. The host of this feast, the man who has summoned us to Windsor for the Christmas court of 1358, is Edward III, King of England. He is 46 years old. He has been on the throne for 31 years. He is, by every contemporary measure, the most successful and most admired English monarch since the Norman conquest. His reign has, over the previous decade, seen the battles of Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, two of the most famous victories of the Hundred Years' War, and the conquest of Calais in 1347. The English military reputation by 1358 stands at a height that it had not previously reached and would not reach again for centuries. Edward III is, in the cultural moment of his Christmas court, at the absolute peak of his career, and he has, this Christmas, two extraordinary guests at his table. The first is King David II of Scotland. He has been Edward's prisoner since 1346, when he was captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross 12 years ago. He is a man in his mid-30s. He is, by the arrangement of his captivity, treated more as a royal guest than as a prisoner. He has his own apartments at Windsor. He has, by every contemporary account, an open invitation to hunt in the royal forests, to attend the royal feasts, to participate in the social life of the English court. His ransom, £66,600, has been negotiated. He will be released in the autumn of 1357, the year before our Christmas feast, but he is still, for various reasons of state and outstanding payments, a regular guest at Edward's court in the period we are interested in. The second is King John II of France. He has been Edward's prisoner for 2 years, since the Battle of Poitiers in September 1356. He is also a man in his late 30s. He too is treated more as a royal guest than as a prisoner. He has his own apartments at Windsor, specifically at the Savoy Palace in London, where he holds his own court, but he travels between London and Windsor in the company of the English royal family. He hunts. He hawks. He attends mass. He plays chess. He commissions works of art from the English court painters. He is in the cultural moment of his captivity, conducting what amounts to an extended royal visit, with the exception that he cannot leave. He will not be released until 1360, 2 years after our feast. His ransom, when finally agreed, will be 3 million gold crowns, the largest single ransom in medieval European history. Both kings, on the evening we are interested in, will be sitting at the high table beside Edward III. The political symbolism of the arrangement: three crowned kings at a single Christmas feast, two of them captives of the third, is impossible to miss. Edward, in the way of an experienced political performer, has staged the scene with absolute calculation. The rest of Europe, when news of the Christmas feast reaches it, will receive the message that he wants them to receive, that the English crown, in 1358, holds in its hand the kings of France and Scotland, that the medieval order of European royalty has in this Christmas hall been temporarily reorganized around a single English centre. This is the occasion we are going to spend the evening at. The Christmas feast at Windsor in 1358, with two captive kings at the high table, with the assembled chivalry of England in the body of the hall, with the great fire burning in the central hearth, and the 200 candles flickering on the gold and silver of the high table, with the theatrical ritual of the medieval royal feast about to be unfolded over the course of the next 8 hours. Get comfortable.
We are about to begin. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you.
If you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss an evening like this one. Before we begin, I want to say a word about the approach that we are going to take tonight. The medieval royal feast is, in the cultural memory of the modern world, one of the most heavily mythologized of all the institutions of the past. The Hollywood image of the medieval feast, with its rough-hewn nobles tearing at half-cooked meat with their teeth, throwing bones to the dogs under the tables, drinking deeply from goblets of unmixed wine while their fingers drip with grease, is, by the judgment of every modern historian who has worked on the period, almost entirely fictitious. The reality of the medieval royal feast was, in fact, the opposite of that image. It was an institution of considerable refinement, considerable etiquette, and considerable artistic accomplishment, conducted by men and women who were, in their own cultural terms, every bit as carefully mannered as any subsequent generation of European aristocrats. The boar's head was carved with great precision rather than torn apart by hand. The wine was diluted with water, the bones were not thrown to the dogs, and the conversation was conducted in the elaborate French and Latin of the medieval royal court, in the careful registers that the social occasion required.
What we are going to do tonight, therefore, is to set aside the Hollywood image and to spend our evening with the historical reality. The historical reality is, by the cumulative judgment of those who have studied it, considerably more interesting than the Hollywood version. It is also considerably cozier. The real medieval feast, properly understood, is one of the most genuinely cozy institutions in the entire history of European hospitality. Let us begin. Before we go into the hall and take our seats, I want to spend a few minutes outside, in the physical setting of Windsor Castle on a December evening in 1358, because the landscape of the castle and the weather of the season are part of the atmosphere of the entire night.
Windsor Castle, in 1358, is one of the principal royal residences of the English crown. It stands on a steep hill above the River Thames, 22 miles west of the City of London, in the landscape of the royal hunting forest that surrounds it.
The castle has been there, in some form, since the late 11th century. William the Conqueror established the original wooden Motte and Bailey structure on the site shortly after the Norman conquest, and his successors had gradually replaced the original wooden buildings with the stone constructions that, by 1358, occupy most of the site.
The castle in 1358 is in the middle of a great rebuilding program. Edward III has been, since the early 1350s, conducting the most ambitious royal building project in England since the time of Henry II. He has rebuilt large sections of the upper ward, the eastern half of the castle, in the new perpendicular Gothic style that is, in the middle of the 14th century, beginning to define English architectural taste. He has built new royal apartments. He has built a new chapel, the Chapel of St. George, that is, by 1358, beginning to take shape on the site that the modern St. George's Chapel still occupies. He has built, most spectacularly, the Great Round Building, sometimes called the House of the Round Table, that he had constructed in the early 1340s for the projected revival of King Arthur's Round Table that we will return to later in the evening. The whole castle, by 1358, is a substantial complex of stone buildings, perhaps a quarter of a mile from end to end, with two great courtyards in the to enclose the whole. The buildings are made of a local limestone, the heath stone quarried in the surrounding chalk hills, which gives the castle, in daylight, the pale yellow-grey colour that the English royal castles of the period favoured.
At night, by candlelight and torchlight, the stone takes on a warmer colour, the pale gold that the warm flame light produces on pale stone.
It is, on the evening we are interested in, the 25th of December, 1358, Christmas Day. The day, by the astronomical reckoning of the period, is one of the shortest of the year. The sun has set in the late afternoon, at a little after 4 o'clock. By 4:30, it is fully dark. By 5 o'clock, the cold of a December evening in the Thames Valley has settled in, with the mist that rises from the river beginning to creep up the slope of the castle hill. The temperature is perhaps just below freezing, cold enough that the breath of any guest standing in the courtyard is visible as a white cloud, cold enough that the puddles of the previous afternoon have frozen into thin sheets of ice on the cobbles. The guests are arriving. They have come, over the course of the previous several days, from various parts of the country. The senior nobles whose own castles and manor houses are in the surrounding counties, plus a smaller number of more distant figures who have made the long journey from the north or the west, specifically for the Christmas court. They have travelled by horse in the way that all medieval travel was conducted, with their retinues of servants and pages and grooms and carts carrying their luggage. They have come up the Thames Valley in the grey December weather, through the landscape of bare trees and frozen mud, and the smoke of village hearths rising from the wattle and daub cottages of the surrounding villages. They have arrived at Windsor in groups of varying size, some with followings of perhaps a dozen attendants, some with larger followings of perhaps 50 or 60. I want you to picture the scene of arrivals in the lower ward of the castle, in the late afternoon of Christmas Day, perhaps an hour before the feast is due to begin.
The lower ward, the western courtyard of the castle, just inside the main gate, is full of horses and men and carts.
The grooms of the various senior guests are walking the horses up and down the courtyard to keep them warm. The pages of the guests are standing in groups, holding their masters' cloaks and gloves, waiting for the moment when their masters will return from the private greetings in the inner ward and will be ready to be conducted to their lodgings. Servants from the royal household, distinguishable by the livery they wear, in the colours of the king's household, with the badge of the leopards of England embroidered on the breast of their tunics, move through the crowd, directing the new arrivals to the appropriate guest accommodations and ensuring that the protocol of arrivals is correctly observed. The senior guests, meanwhile, are being received in the upper ward. The royal apartments are in the upper ward, at the eastern end of the castle, and the great hall, where the feast will take place, is also in the upper ward. The senior guests, on arrival, are conducted by a royal usher into one of the smaller reception chambers, off the great hall, where they are greeted by one of the senior officers of the king's household, usually the chamberlain or one of his deputies, and where they wait for the moment when the king himself will descend from his private apartments to greet them personally. The weather, the cold of the December evening, the arrangement of horses and men and carts in the courtyard, the pale gold colour of the stone walls in the warm flame light of the torches, the smell of wood smoke from the various fires burning in the various hearths of the castle, all of this composes itself, on the evening of the 25th of December 1358, into the atmospheric scene that any guest arriving at Windsor for the Christmas feast would have walked into. It is one of the great moments of the medieval royal year.
The Christmas court is the principal social occasion of the royal calendar, more important, in some ways, than any other event of the year.
The senior nobles who have been invited to attend it have, in the reckoning of medieval social politics, been signalled out for royal favour.
The senior guests who have not been invited will, in the way of these things, spend the next 3 months wondering what they may have done to displease the king.
The whole social fabric of the English nobility, by the arithmetic of the Christmas invitation list, is being subtly rearranged in front of our eyes. Before we go inside, before we follow the senior guests into the great hall and take our seats, I want to spend a moment on Edward III himself, because the personality of the host is the organizing principle of the entire evening.
Edward III is, by 1358, in the late middle period of his reign. He is 46 years old. He has been on the throne since 1327, when he came to the throne at the age of 14 after the deposition of his father Edward II by his mother Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. He had, at the age of 17, conducted his own coup against Mortimer, riding by night to Nottingham Castle with a group of his trusted knights, and personally arresting his mother's lover in his own chamber, and had assumed, from that moment in October 1330, the personal rule of the kingdom that he had nominally held for the previous 3 years. He had spent the following decades building, with extraordinary success, the military and political reputation of the English crown. He had defeated the Scots at Halidon Hill in 1333. He had launched, in 1337, the long sequence of wars with France that historians would, in subsequent centuries, give the name of the 100 Years' War. He had won the great naval battle of Sluys in 1340. He had won the great land battle of Crécy in 1346. He had captured Calais in 1347. He had presided over the foundation of the Order of the Garter, the order of chivalry that we will return to later in the evening, in 1348. He had, by the battles of his eldest son Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince in the 1350s, extended the English military presence into the south of France, leading to the great victory at Poitiers in 1356, in which the King of France himself had been captured. By 1358, he is at the absolute peak of his career. Horrible to Mars. The superb casadu a bare paus plantation had the little stories. Das brunch haben some bars and both pensuden some panses, and the substantial blonde beard. He has the bearing of a king who has, in the phrase of the period, won his place by his own sword. He is, by every contemporary account, charming in private conversation, generous with his rewards to his loyal servants, careful with the symbolic ceremonial of kingship, and shrewd in his political calculations. He is also, by the judgment of his courtiers, a man who genuinely enjoys the theatrical pleasures of his own court, the feasts, the tournaments, the chivalric ceremonies, the occasions of public splendour that the medieval royal year provided. The Christmas feast at Windsor in 1358 is, in this sense, very much his own occasion. He has planned it. He has approved the guest list. He has reviewed the menus. He has chosen the decorations of the great hall. He has, by the careful exercise of his royal taste, made the entire evening exist in his own image. The guests, when they take their seats at the long oak tables in the body of the hall, are sitting in a room that the king himself has personally arranged for them. I want to spend a moment, before we go inside, on the figure of the Black Prince, because the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, the king's eldest son and heir, is one of the most consequential figures in the room we are about to enter, and the story of his recent career is the story that gives the Christmas feast of 1358 much of its meaning.
Edward of Woodstock was born in June 1330, 28 years old, in December 1358, in the prime of his physical and military career,
and had been given the personal nickname, the Black Prince, although, by the judgment of modern historians, the nickname does not appear to have been used during his own lifetime, but was applied to him in the subsequent centuries, possibly because of the colour of the armour he wore in battle, possibly because of the dark reputation his military campaigns had left in the memory of his French enemies. He had, by 1358, fought in 3 of the major battles of his father's wars. He had commanded the right wing of the English army at the Battle of Crecy in 1346, at the age of 16 by every account, with great personal courage, although the senior English commanders had carefully avoided giving him any independent command that might have exposed him to the full risks of medieval battle. He had been knighted by his father on the morning of the battle, with the phrase that the period considered appropriate for such moments. He had emerged from the battle with the reputation of a young man who had performed his duties with the courage that the medieval chivalric tradition required. He had, in the years afterward, conducted a series of military expeditions in southern France, raiding the French territories along the frontier of the English-controlled Gascony in the way that the medieval war required. His great moment had come in September 1356, 2 years before our feast at the Battle of Poitiers. The Black Prince, then 26 years old, had been leading a raiding expedition through central France with an army of perhaps 6,000 English troops. He had been intercepted near the city of Poitiers by the much larger French army of King John II, perhaps 15,000 French troops, with all the senior French nobility in attendance. The battle that followed had been one of the most extraordinary military engagements of the entire 14th century. The tactical use of the English longbow in the defensive position that the Black Prince had chosen, had broken the French cavalry charges. The French infantry had been overwhelmed in the subsequent fighting. By the end of the day, the French army had been comprehensively defeated, and King John II of France himself, having fought with great personal courage in the final stages of the battle, refusing to flee even when his position had become hopeless, had been captured by the English forces. The consequence of Poitiers was the situation we have been describing. The King of France, captured in battle, became Edward III's prisoner. The political balance of Western Europe was, in the instant of John's surrender on the field at Poitiers, transformed.
The Black Prince, by the personal command of the army that had achieved this result, became overnight one of the most celebrated military figures of the entire medieval period. His reputation, by 1358, stood at a height that no other young military commander in Europe could match.
He is, on the evening we are interested in, sitting at the high table beside his father, in the position of honour appropriate to the heir apparent. He is dressed, like his father, in the most splendid costume that the royal wardrobe can produce. He is, by every contemporary account, a physically impressive young man, tall, handsome, with the blonde Plantagenet colouring of his father, with the bearing of a man who has, at 28, already accomplished the things that most men of his class would consider the great achievements of an entire lifetime. He is, in the cultural moment of the Christmas feast 1358, the living embodiment of the chivalric ideal that his father has spent his entire reign promoting. The tragedy of the Black Prince's subsequent life, that he would die in 1376, at the age of 46, from a lingering illness contracted during a later Spanish campaign, leaving his own young son Richard to inherit the throne after his grandfather's death the following year, is not yet visible in 1358. He is, this evening, at the peak of his personal career, with the full expectation of a long royal life ahead of him. He will, in another 17 years, die before his father. The subsequent succession crisis, Richard II's deposition by Henry IV, the long wars of the Roses, the eventual accession of the Tudor dynasty, is all in the future, in the way that all future tragedies are in the future to the people who live before them.
On the evening we are interested in, the Black Prince is simply the king's eldest son, sitting at the high table beside his father, on the Christmas evening when both of them are at the peak of their respective achievements.
He is, on the evening we are interested in, about to descend from his private apartments at the eastern end of the castle and to take his place at the high table. Beside him will be his queen, Philippa of Hainaut, the Flemish princess he had married in 1328, at the age of 15, who is also in her mid-40s, and who has been, throughout his reign, the calm and dignified presence at the centre of the English court. Beside the Queen will be the 2 captive kings, David of Scotland and John of France, in the arrangement we have already described. Beside the king will be his eldest son and heir, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, 28 years old, the hero of Crécy and Poitiers, the embodiment of the chivalric ideal that Edward III has spent his entire reign promoting. The other royal children, Edward and Philippa, have had 13 children in total, of whom several are still alive and living at the English court, will be distributed among the senior places of the high table. The royal family of England, in the arrangement of the Christmas evening, will sit on the dais at the eastern end of the great hall, in the warm light of the candles, with the assembled English nobility in the body of the hall below them, with the great fire burning in the central hearth in the middle of the floor, with the music of the royal minstrels playing from the gallery above the screen's passage at the western end. The whole theatrical arrangement of the medieval royal feast, which had been developing by 1358 for several centuries, will be unfolded in front of the assembled company over the course of the next 8 hours.
That is what we have come to Windsor to see. Let us go inside. Before we go into the great hall and take our seats, though, I want to take you somewhere else first.
I want to take you down a stone passage to the kitchen complex of Windsor Castle, because the work that has been going on in the kitchens for the past several days is one of the most extraordinary aspects of the entire feast, and it is the aspect of the medieval royal feast that the modern reader most often fails to appreciate. We will, in our imagination, go back 12 hours. It is now the morning of Christmas Day, 1358. The feast is not due to begin until the evening, the time, by the medieval reckoning, of about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with the arrival of the senior guests in their first public ceremonial encounters, before the actual feast begins at perhaps 5, and the kitchens have been working, by this point, since perhaps 3 in the morning. The kitchens of Windsor Castle in 1358 are not a single room. They are a substantial complex of separate buildings, each dedicated to a branch of the royal food preparation. There is the great kitchen, the principal cooking room, with the great roasting hearths, and the large boiling cauldrons, and the pastry ovens, and the spit roasting equipment.
There is the bakehouse, a separate building entirely, with its own ovens, dedicated to the production of the bread that the entire castle consumes.
There is the larder, the cold storage room where meat is hung, and where the perishable supplies are kept. There is the buttery, the room where ale and wine are dispensed, presided over by the butler. There is the saucery, the dedicated room where the elaborate sauces of the medieval kitchen are prepared.
There is the spicery, the room where the precious spices of the kitchen are stored in carefully locked cupboards, presided over by the spicer. There is the wafery, the separate room where wafers and fine pastries are produced.
There is the boiling house, the separate room dedicated to the boiling of meats and the production of stocks. There is the scullery, the room where the wooden and pewter and silver dishes of the kitchen are washed and stored. The whole complex is connected by a network of stone passages and service stairs to the great hall and to the various royal apartments of the upper ward. The smell of the kitchens, on the morning of Christmas Day 1358, is one of the definitive smells of the entire castle. The mixed warm aroma of roasting meat and baking bread, and simmering broth and spiced wine, all carried on the damp warm air of the kitchen passages, drifting through the castle on the currents that the great fires create. I want to spend a moment, before we go into the kitchens themselves, on the work that has been going on in the days before Christmas Day, because the preparation for the Christmas feast at Windsor in 1358 has been a matter of weeks rather than hours, and the scale of the advanced preparations is one of the aspects of the medieval royal kitchen that the modern reader most often fails to appreciate. The game and meat for the feast has been, by the morning of Christmas Day, hanging in the larder for between 3 days and a week, the medieval custom being that meat was substantially better when it had been allowed to age for several days before cooking, in the cool conditions of the larder, where the natural enzymes of the meat would soften the muscle fibers and develop the deeper flavor that the period preferred. The large game animals, the boars, the deer, the cattle, had been slaughtered 3 to 4 days before the feast, hung in the larder by their hocks on the iron hooks that the larderer had spent the autumn preparing, and would now, on the morning of Christmas Day, be brought into the kitchen for the final butchery and preparation. The smaller fowl, the swans and peacocks and cranes and pheasants, had been killed perhaps a day or two earlier in the shorter hanging period that the medieval kitchen considered appropriate for the smaller birds. The work of butchery, by the morning of Christmas Day, has been largely completed in the separate butchery building that stands beside the larder. The butchery is conducted by the senior butchers of the household, 3 or 4 men in heavy leather aprons, with the knives and saws and cleavers of their trade. The carcasses have been broken down into the cuts that the kitchen requires. The haunches and shoulders and saddles for the great roasts, smaller pieces for the pies and pottages, the organ meats for the delicacies. The whole process of butchery, conducted with the careful attention that the period required, has produced by Christmas morning the neat assembled stock of cut meats that the cooks will work with through the day. The bakehouse has been operating similarly for several days. The senior baker of the household, an officer of considerable rank and considerable skill, with a staff of perhaps 15 assistants, has been producing the various breads of the feast in continuous shifts since the 20th of December. There are several different kinds of bread required. The fine white manchet loaves for the high table, made of the most refined wheat flour that the royal estates can produce, baked in round shapes of perhaps 6 inches across, with the characteristic cross cut into the top, before baking that is the signature of the period's manchet bread. The slightly coarser white loaves for the senior nobles at the lower tables, made of slightly less refined flour, but still of fine quality. The brown loaves for the more junior of the invited guests, made of mixed wheat and rye flour. The trencher loaves, substantial round loaves, baked specifically to be allowed to go stale for several days before being cut into the trenchers that will serve as the eating surfaces for every guest at the feast. The pastry blanks for the great pies, the thick discs of pastry, prepared in advance and laid out on the pastry cook's tables, ready to be filled and sealed and baked on Christmas morning. The senior baker's staff have been working, by Christmas Day, for perhaps a week of long days. The bakehouse ovens, 3 of them, large brick ovens with iron doors, fired by the oak and beech firewood that the royal forests supplied, have been running almost continuously, with the cycles of firing and cooling and baking proceeding through the extended working day that the period required.
The cumulative output by Christmas morning runs into thousands of loaves, enough not only for the Christmas feast itself, but for the extended Christmas court that will continue at Windsor for the full 12 days of Christmas, with the assembled guests being fed at smaller daily meals throughout that period.
The whole operation, by the scale of its output, is comparable to a modern hotel kitchen serving 1,000 meals a day. The senior staff who run it are professionals of the highest available level. The master cook, in particular, would have been one of the most highly trained and most highly compensated officers of the entire royal household, with the knowledge of the medieval culinary tradition that several decades of professional service had given him. The staff of the kitchens, on Christmas Day 1358, are perhaps 150 people. There is the master cook, the senior figure who runs the entire kitchen complex, who answers directly to the king's officer of the household, and beneath him there are the undercooks, the specialist subcooks, the water carriers, who fetch water from the castle wells, and the pages and serving men who will, in the evening, carry the finished dishes from the kitchens to the great hall.
I want you to picture the great kitchen itself on the morning of Christmas Day, perhaps 8 hours before the feast. The room is large, perhaps 50 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a high vaulted stone ceiling and stone-flagged floors.
The walls are of pale stone, blackened by the accumulated soot of decades of smoke. There are 2 great hearths, one along the north wall and one along the south wall, each perhaps 15 feet wide, with the great chimney hoods rising up to the roof above. In each hearth, a great fire is burning. The fires are not the decorative fires of a domestic interior. They are working fires, perhaps 4 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with great heaps of glowing oak logs, supplied by the wood carriers in regular intervals throughout the day. The heat in front of each hearth, even at a distance of 10 feet, is considerable.
Spit-turners who work at the hearths wear protective leather aprons and leather gloves to shield their hands from the heat, and they take frequent turns at the spit so that no single man has to endure the heat for more than perhaps 15 or 20 minutes at a time.
In front of each hearth, the great spits are turning. The spits are made of iron rods perhaps 6 feet long, supported on iron uprights at either end, with iron forks and skewers along the length to hold the meat in place. On the spit at the north hearth this morning, 2 whole boars are roasting substantial animals, perhaps 150 pounds each, killed and bled and butchered 3 days ago, and now in the final hours of the slow roast that the period preferred. On the spit at the south hearth, a selection of game is roasting: a swan, a peacock, 2 cranes, several pheasants, a variety of the smaller fowl that the medieval kitchen treated as the decorative roasts of the great feast. The juices from the roasts drip into shallow iron pans placed beneath the spits, where they collect to be used later as the basis of sauces and gravies. In the centre of the room, on the large oak tables that run down the middle of the kitchen, the work of preparing the smaller dishes is going on simultaneously. The pastry cook and his assistants are working on the pies and tarts that will form a substantial part of the first and second courses of the feast. The pies, in the medieval style, are large, perhaps 18 inches across, with thick pastry crusts that serve more as cooking containers than as edible parts of the dish.
Fillings are extraordinary combinations of meat and dried fruit and spices and almond milk that the modern reader would find almost startling.
There is, this morning, a great pie being prepared that contains pieces of venison, mixed with raisins and currants and dates, and quantities of cinnamon and cloves and saffron and ginger, bound together with the yolks of perhaps 30 eggs. There is another pie containing pieces of capon, a castrated cockerel, mixed with whole hard-boiled egg yolks, and pieces of bone marrow, and quantities of sugar and ginger. There is a custard pie, a crustard lombard, in the period name, containing quantities of cream and eggs and dates and prunes, sweetened with sugar, and flavoured with quantities of saffron. Each of these pies is, by the judgment of the modern palate, faintly strange. The medieval combination of meat and sweetness, of savoury and fruit, of game and spice, is not a combination that survives in modern cookery. But each pie is also, by the judgment of its own period, an extraordinarily refined object. The recipes have been developed over generations. The ingredients have been calibrated with great care. The spices, in particular, have been selected and measured with the attention of the kitchen of a king, who can afford to use them in quantities that no other kitchen in England can match.
I want to spend a moment on the spices because the spices are the most expensive single item in the entire kitchen, and they are the feature that most clearly distinguishes the royal kitchen from any other kitchen of the period.
The spice cupboard at Windsor in 1358 contains in carefully labelled wooden boxes and glass jars a remarkable range of substances. There is pepper, black pepper, brought from the Malabar coast of India along the overland trade routes through the Middle East. There is ginger, dried ginger root, also from India, used in substantial quantities. There is cinnamon, the bark from the cinnamon tree of Ceylon, scraped and dried and packed in bundles for the long journey to Europe. There is cloves from the spice islands of Indonesia, perhaps the most expensive single spice in the cupboard, used sparingly. There is nutmeg, also from Indonesia, also expensive. There is mace, the outer covering of the nutmeg seed, considered a separate spice in the medieval kitchen. There is saffron, the dried stigmas of the crocus flower, grown in southern Europe and the Middle East, perhaps even more expensive per ounce than cloves. There is cube pepper, grains of paradise, galingale, the lesser-known spices of the medieval kitchen, each with its own flavour and its own use. There is sugar, which in 1358 is treated by every working kitchen in Europe as a spice rather than a sweetener, and which is sold in the solid loaves called sugar loaves that the kitchen breaks down with iron sugar cutters as needed. All of these spices have travelled to reach the kitchen at Windsor, the long routes of the medieval spice trade. Pepper from Malabar travels by ship to the Persian Gulf, by camel caravan across Arabia and through Mesopotamia to the eastern Mediterranean, by ship across the Mediterranean to Venice or Genoa, by mule across the Alps and through France or Germany to the Channel ports, by ship across the Channel to England, and by cart along the roads of southern England to the royal warehouses in London, from which it is finally transferred to the spicery at Windsor. The whole journey takes, in 1358, perhaps 2 years.
The cost of pepper, by the time it has completed the journey, is approximately 20 times its weight in silver. The cost of cloves and saffron is several times higher again. I want to spend a moment on the cumulative human story that each grain of pepper in the spicery represents, because the spice trade of the 14th century was one of the most extraordinary commercial networks in human history, and the peppercorns in the wooden boxes of the spicery have, by the time of their arrival at Windsor, passed through the hands of perhaps 100 different people in a dozen different cultures.
The peppercorn begins its life on a vine in the tropical forests of the Malabar coast, the southwestern edge of the Indian subcontinent, in the region around the city that the modern world calls Kochi. The vine is tended by an Indian peasant farmer, working in the plantation system that has supplied the spice trade since the classical period. The peppercorns are harvested green, dried in the sun until they turn the characteristic black color and the wrinkled shape that the modern reader recognizes, then sold by the farmer to a local merchant. The local merchant takes the peppercorns to the port of Calicut on the Malabar coast, where they are sold to an Arab trader. The Arab trader loads the peppercorns onto a dhow, a wooden trading ship of the traditional design that had operated in the Indian Ocean for centuries, and sails them across the Indian Ocean and up the Persian Gulf to the Iraqi port of Basra on the Tigris-Euphrates river system. The voyage takes perhaps 3 months, depending on the monsoon winds. From Basra, the peppercorns are transferred to camels, the great camel caravans that traversed the overland trade routes of the medieval Middle East and carried across the Arabian and Mesopotamian deserts to the cities of Damascus and Aleppo in the Mediterranean Levant. The overland journey takes perhaps another 2 or 3 months. From Damascus or Aleppo, the peppercorns are sold to the Italian merchants, Venetian and Genoese principally, who have established their trading colonies in the Levantine ports. The Italian merchants load the peppercorns onto their Mediterranean galleys and sail them across the Mediterranean to Venice or Genoa, in voyages that take perhaps another 6 weeks. From Venice or Genoa, the peppercorns are sold to the North European merchants, the great trading families of Augsburg and Cologne and Bruges, who carry the spices over the Alps and through the river systems of Central Europe to the Channel ports of the Low Countries. From the Channel ports, the peppercorns are loaded onto English ships and sailed across the Channel to London. From London, they are bought by the royal household's officers and transported by cart to the royal warehouses in the city. From the warehouses, they are finally transferred in wooden boxes, sealed against pilfering, to the spicery at Windsor, where they are received by the spicer of the household and locked into the spice cupboards under his personal control. The whole journey, from the Indian vine to the spice cupboard at Windsor, has involved perhaps 15 separate transactions, perhaps a dozen different languages, perhaps 4 or 5 different religious cultures, and a cumulative travel distance of perhaps 8,000 miles. The peppercorn that the master cook is, on Christmas morning 1358, measuring out from the spice cupboard for the camelline sauce that will accompany the boar's head, has been on a journey that any modern transcontinental commodity would find difficult to match. The royal kitchen of Edward III consumes these spices on the occasion of the great Christmas feast in quantities that no other kitchen in England can afford. The Christmas feast of 1358 will use, by the careful estimates of the surviving royal accounts, perhaps 2 pounds of pepper, half a pound of cloves, several ounces of saffron, larger quantities of ginger and cinnamon, and smaller quantities of the other spices. The total cost of the spices alone, in modern terms, runs into many thousands of pounds. The spices are part of what makes the feast a royal feast, part of the demonstration of wealth that the entire occasion is, at one level, designed to make. The work in the kitchen continues all morning and into the afternoon. The roasts on the spits are basted at regular intervals with the juices that have collected in the pans below, the basting being conducted by the assistant cooks with great, long-handled iron ladles. The pies are sealed with their pastry tops and put into the pastry ovens to bake. The sauces are prepared in the saucery, the medieval combinations of wine and vinegar and almond milk and spices and herbs, thickened with breadcrumbs or with the yolks of eggs, that the period considered the principal way of dressing meat. The bread, baked the previous day in the bakehouse, is brought up in great wicker baskets, the manchet loaves of fine white bread for the high table, the coarser loaves of brown bread for the lower tables.
The trenchers, the thick slices of stale bread that will serve as the principal eating surface for each guest, are cut from older loaves of bread that have been deliberately allowed to go stale for the purpose, and are stacked in neat piles ready to be carried to the great hall.
By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the kitchen is in the final stage of its preparations. The roasts are nearly finished, the pies are out of the oven and resting on cooling stands. The sauces are in their copper pots, ready to be reheated at the last moment before serving.
The subtleties, the elaborate sugar sculptures that will be brought into the hall between the courses, which we will return to in a few minutes, are sitting on their display trays in the cold of the buttery, ready to be carried up at the appointed moments.
The serving men, the household servants who will carry the dishes from the kitchen to the great hall, are beginning to assemble in the stone passage between the kitchens and the hall. They are wearing the royal household livery, the tunics in the colours of the king, with the badge of the leopards of England embroidered on the breast, and they have been carefully briefed by the master cook on the order in which the dishes are to be carried up, the routes through the castle that they are to follow, and the ceremonial in which each dish is to be presented to the high table.
Up in the great hall, meanwhile, the staff of the hall have spent the morning preparing the room.
The tapestries have been hung, the candles have been placed, the salt cellars and the silver gilt plate have been set out on the high table. The trestle tables in the body of the hall have been covered with their long white linen cloths. The benches have been arranged. The musicians have arrived in their gallery and have tuned their instruments. The whole room has been prepared, with the careful attention of decades of accumulated household practice, for the evening that is about to begin.
The senior guests, by 4:30, are arriving in the courtyards outside. The whole machinery of the medieval royal Christmas feast is, in the final hour before the evening begins, ready to be set in motion. Let us go into the hall now.
We will, in our imagination, walk from the courtyard up the stone steps to the entrance of the great hall, through the outer porch, past the royal usher, who is checking the names of the arriving guests against his written list, into the screen's passage, and through the central doorway into the body of the hall itself.
The screen's passage is the architectural feature that separates the lower end of the hall from the kitchen end of the building. It is a narrow corridor, perhaps 8 feet wide, running across the full width of the hall, with a tall wooden screen on one side that separates it from the hall proper.
The screen has, traditionally, 3 doorways through it, one in the centre, 2 at either end, through which the guests enter the hall and through which the servants pass with the dishes from the kitchens.
Above the screen, the minstrel's gallery looks down on both the screen's passage and the body of the hall, an elevated wooden platform where the musicians will play throughout the evening.
You step through the central doorway of the screen. The hall opens out in front of you. I want you to take a moment with the scene that you are now looking at, because the Great Hall of Windsor, on Christmas evening 1358, in the moments just before the feast begins, is one of the most beautiful interiors that you will see in your imaginative walk through the medieval period.
The hall stretches away from you toward the dais at the eastern end.
It is 100 feet long. The walls rise on both sides to a height of perhaps 30 feet, and above the walls the great timber roof rises another 15 feet to its pointed apex. The roof is not flat. It is supported by a series of great oak trusses, substantial wooden beams, perhaps 18 inches square, arching across the hall at intervals of about 15 feet, with the spaces between the trusses filled in with smaller timbers, and the decorative wooden carvings that the royal carpenters had produced for Edward III's recent rebuilding of the hall. The whole roof structure is, in the candlelight of the evening, a dark, warm brown, with the shadows of the trusses falling across the lower beams in the way that any timber roof at night produces. The walls of the hall are hung with tapestries. There are perhaps a dozen of them, each perhaps 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, in the heavy woven style that the medieval period had developed for interior wall decoration. Each tapestry shows a scene, biblical, mythological, historical. There is a tapestry showing the story of David and Goliath, with the figure of the young shepherd wielding his sling against the giant Philistine in the pictorial style of the early 14th century. There is a tapestry showing a hunt, a party of mounted nobles riding through a stylized forest, with hounds and stags in the foreground, the whole worked in deep reds and greens and golds.
There is a tapestry showing a tournament knights jousting in front of an assembled court of ladies and lords, with the heralds blowing their trumpets from the stands. The whole cumulative effect of the tapestries, covering most of the wall surface, in their deep colours, in the candlelight, is to make the great stone hall feel, in the way that the medieval interior was meant to feel, like an enclosed jewel box of warm colour.
The floor of the hall is covered, in the traditional medieval style, with rushes. Fresh rushes, gathered that morning from the reed beds along the Thames below the castle, have been spread across the stone flagstones to a depth of about 2 inches. The rushes have been mixed by the senior household servants with the aromatic herbs that the period favoured for the freshening of an interior sweet flag, lavender, rosemary, and dried rose petals that have been kept since the previous summer for exactly this purpose.
The smell of the rushes, when you step on them, is the particular sweet vegetal smell of fresh gathered river plants, mixed with the dry herbal smell of the dried herbs, a compound smell that, in the cultural memory of the period, was the definitive smell of any well-kept medieval interior.
In the centre of the hall, in the space between the long tables, the great fire is burning in the central hearth. The hearth is a raised stone platform, perhaps 10 feet square, in the middle of the floor.
The fire on it is a substantial fire, perhaps 3 feet high, with great logs of oak burning steadily, with the orange flames dancing up perhaps another 2 feet above the logs.
The smoke from the fire rises straight up to the Louvre in the centre of the roof above, an opening of perhaps 6 feet square, covered by a wooden cap that can be opened or closed depending on the wind, through which the smoke escapes and through which fresh air is drawn down into the room. The arrangement is, by the standards of 14th century domestic engineering, remarkably effective. The volume of smoke that actually settles in the body of the hall is, on a still December evening, manageable a haze in the upper third of the hall, with the lower part of the hall remaining clear. Edward III's recent rebuilding of the Great Hall has additionally included some improvements to the ventilation system, with the result that the atmosphere in the hall, by the standards of any earlier medieval hall in England, is comparatively clear. Around the central fire, on the stone platform of the hearth, the kitchen pages have arranged a number of long-handled iron forks and tongs. These are not for cooking. They are for the use of the senior guests who, during the evening, may wish to come down from their seats to warm their hands or their feet at the great fire. The custom of the period that any guest at a great feast was permitted to leave his seat between courses to warm himself at the central fire was one of the comforts that the medieval hall provided. Now look toward the eastern end of the hall, where the dais is. The dais is a raised wooden platform, about 18 inches high, that runs across the full width of the hall, perhaps 40 feet at the eastern end. On the dais, the high table is set. The high table is a long oak table, perhaps 30 feet long and 4 feet wide, of substantial construction, covered for the evening with a cloth of gold, a heavy fabric of woven gold thread, in the deep yellow gold colour that the medieval period associated with royalty, falling almost to the floor on both sides. Behind the high table, in the arrangement that the protocol of the evening requires, are placed 11 high-backed wooden chairs, substantial chairs, with carved wooden backs and velvet cushions, set at distances from each other in the careful arrangement that the seating plan requires. In the centre of the high table, set on the cloth of gold in front of the place where the king will sit, is an extraordinary object. It is a great salt cellar, a piece of metalwork perhaps 2 feet tall, in the elaborate Gothic style of the mid-14th century, made of silver gilt and decorated with enamelled coats of arms and carved figures. The salt cellar contains, in its upper compartment, a quantity of fine white salt, perhaps half a pound, that will be used by the king and the senior guests during the evening. But the salt cellar is, by the symbolic understanding of the period, much more than a salt container. It is the physical marker of the social hierarchy of the entire room.
I want to spend a moment on the craftsmanship of the Great Salt Cellar, because the object is one of the most extraordinary pieces of medieval English metalwork, and the work of the royal goldsmiths in producing it is part of the cultural achievement of the entire feast. The salt cellar has been made by the senior royal goldsmith over the course of perhaps a year of careful work.
The design has been approved by the king himself, in the way that all major pieces of royal plate were approved in the period, with the drawings produced by the goldsmith's draftsman, presented to the king for his personal approval, modified according to his particular preferences, and then executed in the workshop of the goldsmith with the careful attention that the commission required. The base of the salt cellar is an elaborately decorated silver-gilt platform, perhaps 18 inches square, with carved Gothic tracery around the edges and enamelled coats of arms set at intervals into the decorative panels. Above the base, an octagonal column rises perhaps a foot high, supporting the upper compartment in which the salt is contained. The column is decorated with carved figures, saints, allegorical personifications, the heraldic beasts of the royal arms, each figure perhaps 3 inches high, executed in the elaborate detail that the period required for such ceremonial pieces. The upper compartment itself is in the shape of an octagonal building, a miniature Gothic chapel with carved windows and carved doors and a carved roof, with the salt held in the covered chamber inside. The cumulative effect of the entire piece, when set on the cloth of gold of the high table by candlelight, is one of the most splendid decorative objects that the medieval royal court possessed. The firelight from the central hearth and the candlelight from the candelabra catch the gilded surfaces and the enamelled panels, throwing back the reflected light in the particular way that the medieval period had perfected for its ceremonial silver gilt.
Salt cellar is, in some sense, the single object on the high table that captures, more than any other, the particular aesthetic of the medieval royal feast, the combination of careful craftsmanship and decorative elaboration and symbolic significance that the entire institution had developed over generations. The phrase, above the salt, which has survived in modern English as an idiom for a position of social distinction, comes directly from the arrangement we are now looking at.
The salt cellar marks the division between the senior guests at the high table, who sit above the salt, meaning closer to the centre of the table where the king will sit, and the more junior guests at the same high table who sit below the salt, meaning farther from the king. The same principle applies, in the extended sense, to the distinction between the high table itself, which is above the salt in absolute terms, and the long oak tables in the body of the hall, which are below the salt. The seating arrangement of the entire hall is, in the physical and symbolic sense, organized around the position of this single piece of silver-gilt metalwork in the center of the high table. The high table itself is set, in addition to the great salt cellar, with the full ceremonial silver-gilt plate of the royal household. There are silver-gilt cups for each place, 1 cup per guest, in the elegant goblet shape of the mid-14th century, with decorated rims and gilded interiors. There are knives, 1 knife per guest, with a bone or ivory handle and a polished steel blade laid across the trencher at each place. There are spoons, 1 spoon per guest, also of silver gilt, with decorated handles. There are no forks. The fork, as an eating implement, has not yet arrived in Northern Europe in 1358. It would not become common in England for another 2 centuries. The guests at the high table will eat with their fingers and their knives and their spoons, in the manner that the period considered entirely appropriate. Each place at the high table has, in front of the silver-gilt cup and the silver-gilt knife and the silver-gilt spoon, a trencher of fine white bread, a thick slice of stale bread, perhaps 8 inches across and an inch thick, that has been cut from the trencher loaves baked in the bakehouse for exactly this purpose.
The trencher is the main eating surface for each guest. The food, when it is brought to the table, will be placed on the trencher. The juices and sauces will soak into the trencher as the meal progresses. At the end of each course, the soaked trencher will be removed and a fresh one will be brought. At the end of the entire feast, the accumulated soaked trenchers will be, in the charitable custom of the period, given to the poor of the surrounding area, who will receive them at the castle gates and who will eat them as a welcome supplement to their normal December diet.
The lower tables in the body of the hall are set in a different style. They are long trestle tables, perhaps 20 feet long and 3 feet wide, set up specifically for the evening on iron trestles that have been brought up from the storerooms of the castle. There are 6 such tables, 3 along the north wall of the hall and 3 along the south wall, each capable of seating perhaps 30 guests. The total seating capacity of the hall, between the high table on the dais and the 6 lower tables in the body, is approximately 200, which is the number of guests that the royal household has invited for the Christmas feast of 1358. The lower tables are covered with white linen cloths, not the cloth of gold of the high table, but the finest plain linen of the royal household, freshly laundered for the occasion. They are set with pewter cups rather than silver gilt. The senior guests at the lower tables will drink from pewter. The junior guests at the very lower ends of the lower tables will drink from glazed earthenware. They are set with knives, though at the lower tables the custom is that each guest brings his own knife rather than being provided with one, in the way that all medieval gentlemen carried a personal eating knife on a belt at the hip. They are not set with spoons. The lower tables will receive their spoons separately when the dishes that require spoons arrive. They are set with trenchers of bread in the same manner as the high table, although the bread for the lower tables is of a slightly less fine quality, the second-grade trencher loaves rather than the first-grade. The guests, by 4:30 in the afternoon, have begun to enter the hall.
I want to spend a moment on the costumes of the assembled guests, because the clothing of the medieval royal court at the height of Edward III's reign is one of the aspects of the period that the modern reader most often imagines incorrectly.
The men, by 1358, are wearing the costume that had developed in the previous decade as the successor to the longer robes of the earlier 14th century. The principal garment is the cotehardie, a close-fitting tunic that reaches to the knee or to mid-thigh, made of fine wool or velvet, brightly coloured, often with the decorative embroidery at the hem and the cuffs that the period particularly favoured, that gave the garment its weight and its warmth. Below the cotehardie, the men wear tight-fitting hose, the medieval ancestor of modern stockings, in the bright colours that often deliberately did not match between the 2 legs, one red leg, one blue leg, in the party-coloured fashion that the period's young men favoured. On their feet, the men wear leather shoes pointed in the characteristic medieval style, sometimes with the exaggerated long toes that the period called poulaines, sometimes more modestly proportioned for the older or more conservative figures. The women are wearing the corresponding costume. The principal garment is the cotehardie in its feminine form, a close-fitting gown that reaches to the floor, with a tight bodice and a full skirt made of fine wool or silk or velvet in the same bright colours that the men favoured. The sleeves of the women's cotehardies are particularly elaborate, long, narrow at the elbow, then opening out into the decorative trailing tippets that hang down from the elbow nearly to the floor. Over the cotehardie, the women wear the surcoat, a sleeveless outer garment with deep armholes that show the cotehardie beneath, often in a contrasting colour and contrasting fabric. The most senior women wear, in addition, the decorative belt, a substantial belt worn high on the body, just below the bust, made of decorated leather or of woven silk, with the elaborate metal buckle and decorative pendants hanging from it. On the women's heads, the elaborate headdresses of the period, the veils and the decorative arrangements of hair that the married women of the period wore in public. The most fashionable headdress in 1358 is the crespine, a decorative network of gold or silver wire set with jewels worn over the hair to confine it in the particular shape that the period considered appropriate for a married noblewoman of high rank. Over the crespine, the veil of fine white silk falls down the back, sometimes secured with a jeweled chaplet around the brow. The cumulative effect, when the assembled company is in place at the long oak tables of the great hall in their full Christmas finery, is one of the most splendid scenes that the medieval royal court could produce. The bright colours of the cotehardies, the gleaming gold and silver of the decorative embroidery, and the belts and the brooches, the shifting fabrics of the elaborate sleeves, the decorative headdresses of the women, all of this, by the candlelight of the 200 candles in the iron candelabra and the flickering light of the great central fire, produces the particular jewel box atmosphere that the medieval interior was always designed to produce. They come in order, conducted by the royal ushers who are responsible for the seating. The ushers know, by the careful work of the household chamberlain in the previous days, exactly where each guest is to be seated. Each guest is met at the central doorway of the screen, asked his name and rank, and conducted by an usher to his assigned place at one of the lower tables. The senior guests, those destined for the high table, are conducted up the length of the hall past the central fire to their places on the dais. I want to spend a moment on the social composition of the room as it fills. At the high table, on the dais, the most senior figures of the English royal establishment will be seated. The Earl of Salisbury, the Earl of Warwick, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the senior ecclesiastical figure of the kingdom. 11 figures in total at the high table, in the carefully calculated arrangement that the protocol of the evening requires. At the lower tables, the senior nobility and senior household figures of the kingdom, the earls and barons whose names we know from the records of the period: Northampton, Suffolk, Hereford, March, Stafford, their wives, their senior knights, the senior officers of the royal household, the chamberlain, the steward, the treasurer, the chancellor, Dixintilla, the senior figures of the royal civil service, the keepers of the various royal seals, the senior judges of the king's courts, the senior officers of the royal exchequer. At the very lowest tables, the most junior of the invited guests, the younger sons of senior nobles, the senior pages of the royal household, the successful knights of the tournaments who have been rewarded with the honour of an invitation to the Christmas feast in recognition of their service in the recent French wars. The whole assembled company, by 4:45, is in place. The chairs of the high table are still empty. The royal party will not enter the hall until the final ceremonial moment, after all the other guests have been seated, but the rest of the room is full. The noise of perhaps 200 conversations rises from the long tables. The musicians in the gallery above the screen's passage have begun to play soft, introductory music in the style that the period considered appropriate for the moments before a great feast began. The candles around the room are all lit, throwing their warm yellow light across the guests in their fine costumes. The men in their long fitted tunics in the bright colours that the medieval nobility favoured. The hall is in the moment just before the king enters, ready. A ceremonial trumpet sounds from the gallery above the screen's passage. 3 long calls, the traditional fanfare for the entry of the royal party. The assembled company falls silent. The door at the eastern end of the hall behind the dais, leading to the royal apartments, opens. The king is coming in. The royal party enters the hall in the order that the protocol requires. The first to enter is the senior officer of the household, the steward, in his formal robes, carrying his white wand of office. He walks slowly in front of the royal party, clearing the imaginary path through the hall in the traditional manner. Behind him come the senior gentlemen of the king's chamber, 6 of them, in matching court livery, walking in pairs. Then come the royal heralds, 3 of them, in their tabards embroidered with the leopards of England in gold thread on a red ground, with their silver trumpets at their belts. Then come the senior bishops who will be seated at the high table, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Winchester, in their full episcopal robes of midwinter, with their gold pectoral crosses and their embroidered mitres held by their attendants behind them. Then comes the king himself. Edward III enters the hall on the right side of the doorway, with Queen Philippa on his left arm. He is dressed in the way that the Christmas court of 1358 requires, in the most splendid costume that the royal wardrobe can produce. The tunic falls to the ankle. It is belted at the waist with a gold belt set with precious stones. Around his neck hangs a heavy gold chain with the enamelled badge of the New Order of the Garter, the blue garter with the motto Honi soit qui mal y pense in the gold lettering of the order suspended from it. On his head he wears a gold circlet, set with rubies and sapphires and emeralds in the arrangement that the medieval period preferred for its royal crowns, with fleur-de-lis rising from the band of the circlet at intervals around his head. Queen Philippa, beside him, is dressed in the corresponding splendor, hanging from the elbows in the style of the period. A heavy fabric of woven gold thread, with a surcoat of deep blue velvet over the gown, lined with white ermine. The decorative sleeves of her gown are particularly extravagant, long, trailing sleeves that fall almost to the floor, with the tippets arranged across the top in the careful balance that the period required. Behind the king and queen come the rest of the senior royal party, the Black Prince, the two captive kings, the senior royal children, the senior nobles and bishops, who will be seated at the high table. Each of them is dressed in the way that the evening requires, in the most magnificent costume that his position can support. The royal party walks the length of the dais behind the high table, behind the row of chairs already set out, with each member of the party stopping at his or her appointed place. The king walks all the way to the centre of the high table, the central chair, directly behind the great salt cellar, and stops. He turns to face the assembled company. He stands. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who has taken his place at the north end of the high table, raises his hand. The assembled company in the body of the hall, who have been standing since the moment the king entered, bow their heads. The Archbishop pronounces the Christmas grace in Latin, in the careful Latin pronunciation that the senior English clerics of the period used for the liturgical formulae of their profession. The grace runs to perhaps 30 seconds. It ends with the Amen, repeated by every figure in the room. The Archbishop makes the gesture of blessing over the assembled company. The king sits. The whole assembled company sits. The feast has begun. Before the food itself arrives, however, there is a ceremonial moment that I want to describe to you, because the moment is one of the characteristic features of the medieval royal feast that the modern reader most often fails to appreciate. The medieval custom was that every guest at a great feast washed his hands at the table before each course of the meal. The reason was practical given the medieval practice of eating with the fingers. The cleanliness of the hands at the table was the essential part of the decorum of the meal. But the moment had also become, over the centuries, an elaborate ceremonial occasion in its own right, a theatrical interlude between the moments of eating and the moments of preparation, conducted with the careful attention that the medieval period gave to all such ritual moments. I want you to picture the hand-washing on the high table, in the moments after the grace and before the first course arrives. A senior household servant, the officer who has the title of the ewer, the custodian of the ewers and the basins, enters the hall from the door at the eastern end. He carries in his hands an ornate silver-gilt ewer, a tall jug, perhaps 18 inches high, with elaborate spout and a decorated handle, full of warm-scented water. Behind him comes the assistant, carrying a large silver-gilt basin to receive the used water. Behind the assistant comes a second assistant, carrying a stack of folded white linen towels. The procession moves to the north end of the high table, where the king sits. The ewer kneels in front of the king. The assistant with the basin places the basin under the king's hands. The ewer pours a stream of warm scented water from the ewer over the king's hands, first the right hand, then the left, into the basin below. The water is, by the tradition of the royal household, scented with rose petals and quantities of musk and drops of orange flower water, the aromatic preparation that the senior household servants have prepared earlier in the day for exactly this purpose. The king moves his hands gently in the cascade of water, washing them in the careful manner that the ceremonial requires. The second assistant steps forward with the folded white linen towel. The towel is taken away. The procession then moves down the high table, repeating the same ceremony for each senior guest in turn. The Queen, the Black Prince, the captive kings, the senior nobles and bishops. Each guest washes his hands in the scented water and dries them on the fresh linen towel. The whole procedure takes perhaps 10 or 12 minutes. The body of the hall, meanwhile, is conducting its own simpler version of the same ritual. The assistant ewers and assistants moving up and down the lower tables with simpler ewers and simpler basins and plainer linen towels, but conducting essentially the same operation of hand-washing for each guest at each table. By about 5:15, the whole company has had its hands washed. The ewers and basins have been carried back to the kitchens. The final preparations for the first course are complete. The senior trumpeter in the gallery above the screen's passage raises his silver trumpet. He sounds 3 long blasts. The first course is being brought in. I want you to picture the scene of the first course arriving, because the theatrical entry of the food is one of the great theatrical moments of the medieval royal feast. The procession enters at the western end of the hall, through the central doorway of the screen. It is led in the traditional way by the master of the household, the senior officer responsible for the service of the hall, carrying his white wand of office. Behind him come the senior pages of the household, in their matching livery, in pairs. Behind the pages come the dishes themselves. The first dish, in the order that the medieval royal feast required, is the boar's head. The boar's head is, by the tradition that goes back to the early Middle Ages, the ceremonial centerpiece of the first course of any great Christmas feast. The dish is borne in by 4 senior pages on a great silver-gilt salver, perhaps 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, carried at shoulder height between them. The boar's head itself is a substantial object, the severed head of a large wild boar, which has been carefully prepared in the kitchen earlier in the day. The head has been roasted whole. It has been glazed with an egg and saffron mixture that gives it a deep golden color. The tusks have been polished, the eyes have been replaced with dried fruits, sometimes raisins, sometimes prunes, to give the head a watchful appearance. In the boar's mouth has been placed a roasted apple. Around the head, on the salver, has been arranged a decorative wreath of bay leaves and rosemary, with the sprigs of holly that the period associated with the Christmas season. I want to spend a moment on the symbolic meaning of the boar's head, because the tradition of bringing the boar's head as the first course of a Christmas feast, which had been settled in English royal practice by the early 14th century, was a cultural inheritance with deep roots. The boar, in the cultural imagination of the medieval period, was the most ferocious of the wild beasts of the European forests. A dangerous animal capable of killing the dogs and even the men of a hunting party, the particular quarry of the most experienced and most courageous hunters. The killing of a boar was in the chivalric tradition one of the most respected feats of the medieval hunt, far more respected in the cultural ranking of the period than the killing of a deer or a hare or any of the lesser game. The presentation of the boar's head as the first course of a great feast was therefore a symbolic statement. It announced to the assembled company that the host had subdued the most ferocious creature of the surrounding forests, that the particular feast they were attending had been provisioned by the personal hunting prowess of the royal household, that the abundance of the table flowed from the successful exercise of the chivalric virtues that the host represented. The roasting of the boar's head was, additionally, an extraordinary demonstration of culinary skill in itself. The head, a substantial object, with the complex bone structure of the snout and the tusks and the particular cavity of the skull, required the careful technical attention of the most experienced cooks of the kitchen. It had to be cooked through completely, to the exact degree of doneness that the period considered appropriate. It had to be glazed at exactly the right moment in the cooking, with the egg and saffron mixture applied at the point when the surface of the head was hot enough to set the glaze without burning the underlying skin. It had to be presented, on the salver, in the particular arrangement that the period required, the roasted apple in the mouth at exactly the right angle, the wreath of bay and rosemary disposed around it with exactly the right artistic care, the sprigs of holly arranged at exactly the intervals that the decorative effect required. The procession of the boar's head into the great hall is, by the tradition of the period, accompanied by a particular song. The Boar's Head Carol, which exists in various versions in the surviving medieval song collections, is the traditional accompaniment to the moment when the boar's head is borne into the hall on its salver. The senior minstrel of the gallery, on this Christmas evening at Windsor in 1358, leads the singing of the carol from the gallery, with the other minstrels and several of the senior pages joining in the chorus. The carol's Latin refrain, Caput apri defero, I bring the boar's head, is sung in the solemn ceremonial Latin that the period considered appropriate for such moments. The assembled company in the body of the hall listens with the quiet attention of an audience that knows, by the cumulative experience of decades of similar feasts, exactly what they are participating in. The procession of pages with the boar's head walks slowly the length of the hall in the solemn pace that the moment requires. A great roasted peacock, similarly redressed in its feathers, with its tail spread wide behind it on the salver, several great pies in their golden pastry crusts, a great cauldron of frumenty, served as the traditional accompaniment to roasted venison, with the roasted haunch of venison alongside it. A selection of the smaller dishes of the first course, the tarts and potages and savouries that the period considered appropriate for the first sequence of the meal. As the procession of dishes approaches the high table, the minstrels in the gallery above the screen's passage begin to play a particular piece of ceremonial music in the bright fanfare style of the period, that is, the traditional accompaniment to the entry of the first course at a Christmas feast. The assembled company in the body of the hall watches the procession with the attentive faces of an audience watching a great theatrical performance. The boar's head is set down on the high table directly in front of the king, the senior carver of the household, officer of considerable rank and considerable skill. Often a knight or a senior squire of the king's chamber steps forward. He is wearing the carver's robe of fine green wool with gold embroidery, and he has a belt at his waist from which a selection of carving knives hangs in decorative sheaths. The carver begins his work. I want to spend a moment on the carver, because the carver was one of the most highly trained and most carefully selected officers of any senior medieval household, and the work he was about to do was, by the standards of the period, almost a kind of sacred ritual in its own right. The medieval English text, known as the Boke of Carving, the Book of Carving, which dates from about 1430, but which preserves the traditions of carving that go back to our period and earlier, gives perhaps 30 different carving terms for the ways in which different birds, fish, and joints of meat were to be cut at the table. A swan was to be lifted. A peacock was to be disfigured. A crane was to be displayed. A heron was to be carved into portions. A pheasant was to be allayed. A capon was to be sauced. Each term referred to a particular technique of carving, the way the bird was to be lifted on the carver's fork, the direction in which the cuts were to be made, the ceremonial gestures that accompanied the cutting. The carver had to know, for every dish that came to the high table, the correct term and the correct technique. He had also to know, by heart, the complete protocol of carving for the king. The king did not, by the medieval royal etiquette, carve his own meat. The carver carved it for him. The portions were then taken from the carving knife by the senior page of the chamber and were placed onto the king's trencher, in the portions and with the accompaniments that the dish required. The arrangement was, by the symbolic understanding of the period, a demonstration of royal dignity. The king was to be served, to be ministered to be the recipient of the work of others rather than the performer of his own work, in the way that the entire medieval royal household was structured around the principle that the king did nothing for himself that could be done for him by others. I won't share with you a selection of the carving terms that the senior carver was required to know, because the cumulative effect of the vocabulary captures, more than any other aspect of the medieval feast, the extraordinary refinement of the institution. A swan was lifted, a peacock was disfigured, a crane was displayed, a heron was carved into portions, a pheasant was allayed, a capon was sauced, a duck was unbraced, a goose was reared, a rabbit was unlaced, a salmon was chined, a pike was splatted, a trout was culpoon, a pigeon was thighed, a quail was winged, A plover was minced, a partridge was wing. A lobster was barbed, a crab was tamed, a hen was spoiled, a teal was drawn, a snipe was thighed, a curlew was unjointed, a bittern was unjoined, a pheasant was disjointed, a heron was carved into portions, a boar was leeched, a venison was broken. Each of these terms referred to a particular technique. The carver, when called to the high table to carve a swan, would announce to the assembled company that he was about to lift the swan, would then perform the particular sequence of cuts that the term required. The announcement and the subsequent technique were, in combination, the ceremonial performance that the moment required. The carver, on the evening of Christmas 1358, performs his work on the boar's head with the careful attention that decades of practice have produced. The tongue, which has been cooked separately and replaced in the head for the ceremonial display. The ears, which were considered a delicacy in their own right. Each cut, as it is taken from the knife by the senior page, is placed with careful precision on the gold dish that has been prepared for the king's portion. Sauce, a peppery cameline sauce, made of breadcrumbs and vinegar and cinnamon and ginger, is spooned over the meat by a second page. The dish is set in front of the king. The king takes up his knife. He cuts a portion of the meat. He eats. The boar's head having been carved for the king, the carving proceeds along the high table, the queen's portion, the black prince's portion, the captive king's portions, the senior noble's portions, each in turn, each with the same careful attention. Meanwhile, at the lower tables in the body of the hall, the same work of carving is being conducted by the smaller carvers of the lower tables, who are working their way through the roasted dishes that have been brought to each lower table by the procession of serving pages. The frumenty with venison is portioned out. The smaller dishes, the tarts and potages and savouries are distributed, the wine flows. The cupbearers of the household move up and down the high table, refilling the silver-gilt cups with the Bordeaux red wine that the English court of 1358 favoured for great feasts, the English canoinsamurdi. The guests at the lower tables receive the same wine in their pewter cups, although in slightly smaller quantities. The conversation rises in the hall. The minstrels in the gallery play steadily. The great fire in the central hearth burns bright. I want to spend a moment on the wine itself, because the Bordeaux red of the English royal court in 1358 was a substance considerably different from what the modern reader might imagine. The wine of the period was, by every contemporary account, a lighter-bodied wine than the modern Bordeaux that has descended from it. It was made from grapes grown in the vineyards of Gascony, the region around the city of Bordeaux that had been part of the English crown's continental possessions since the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II in 1152. The grapes were harvested in late September or early October. The wine was made in the traditional way, fermented in wooden vats, then transferred to oak barrels, then shipped to England in the annual wine fleets that left Bordeaux in late autumn, and arrived in the English ports throughout November and December. The wine drunk at the Christmas feast 1358 was therefore very young wine, perhaps 3 months old, by the time of consumption, with the bright fruit character and the relatively low alcohol content that young wine produces. It was drunk fresh, before the complex aged characteristics that the modern wine drinker associates with fine claret had any chance to develop. The quantities consumed at the feast are also worth a moment's attention. The medieval royal household, by the testimony of the surviving accounts, consumed truly substantial quantities of wine, substantially more than would be considered reasonable by modern medical standards. Each guest at the Christmas feast 1358 might drink, over the course of the evening, perhaps a litre and a half of wine, and might continue drinking, in the informal hours after the formal feast, perhaps another half litre. The cumulative effect by the late hours of the evening would be considerable. The medieval custom of the period, however, was to dilute the wine with water at the table, particularly for the smaller eaters and for the women in the cups that the period had developed for the purpose, with the water being added by the cupbearers in the quantities that each individual guest preferred. The final intoxicating effect of the evening's drinking was, by the calculated moderation of the practice, less than a modern reader might assume. The knives that each guest used to cut his food are also worth a moment's attention. The medieval gentleman, as we have already mentioned, carried his own knife, a personal eating knife, perhaps 8 inches long with the blade, on a decorated belt at the hip, in a particular leather sheath. The knife was a personal possession of considerable value. The blade was of fine steel, kept sharp by the daily attention of the gentleman's personal servants. The handle was of bone, ivory, or polished horn, often decorated with inlays of silver or with carved designs. The overall craftsmanship of a senior nobleman's eating knife in 1358 was comparable to the craftsmanship of any other fine personal possession of the period. The careful work of generations of cutlers, refined over the years to the particular standards that the period required. The use of the knife at the table was, similarly, governed by the particular etiquette that the period had developed. The knife was used to cut food into manageable pieces. It was not used as a fork. The food, once cut, was lifted to the mouth with the fingers. The knife was not used to carry food directly to the mouth. That habit, which the period considered unrefined, was associated with the lower classes rather than with the gentry. The knife was kept clean throughout the meal, wiped on the linen napkin that each guest had at his place, or on the tablecloth itself in the case of the more casual diners, and was, at the end of the course, returned to its particular position across the trencher. After about 45 minutes, the signal is given that the first course is ending.
The subtlety is being brought in. I want to spend a moment on the subtlety, because the subtlety is one of the most extraordinary and most distinctive features of the medieval royal feast, and it is the feature that the modern reader is most likely to find genuinely surprising. The word subtlety, sometimes spelled in the medieval texts as subtlety or subtlety, refers to elaborate sculpture made of edible ingredients, brought into the hall between the courses of a great feast.
The principal ingredients of the subtlety were sugar and pastry. From these three materials, the kitchens of the great medieval royal households had developed the capacity to construct sculptures of remarkable size and complexity. Sculptures that depicted, in the way that any seriously ambitious sculpture does, scenes from the cultural imagination of the period. A subtlety might depict a castle, with towers and battlements and tiny figures of knights on the walls. The whole worked in tinted sugar paste. It might depict a ship at sea, with sails and rigging and tiny figures of sailors, with the sea itself worked in blue-tinted sugar paste with waves rising from the surface. It might depict a scene from a chivalric romance knights jousting, ladies watching from a tower, with the heralds and trumpeters arranged around the central scene. It might depict a religious scene, the Nativity at Christmas, the adoration of the Magi, the saint whose feast day was being celebrated. It might depict an allegorical scene, the personifications of the virtues, the seasons of the year, the elements of the medieval cosmos. Each subtlety was, in the tradition that had developed by the mid-14th century, intended to carry a symbolic meaning. The subject of the subtlety was usually selected to make a point about the occasion of the feast, to celebrate a victory, to commemorate a marriage, to honor a guest, to advance a political message. The subtlety brought into the hall at the end of the first course of a great feast was, by the theatrical convention of the period, the principal artistic statement of the host about the meaning of the occasion. For the Christmas feast at Windsor in 1358, the subtlety that has been prepared by the royal kitchens is, as the master of the household has briefed the senior pages who will carry it in, a representation of the legend of King Arthur and his round table. The subtlety is a substantial object. It has been worked over the previous 3 days by the master pastry cook and his assistants on a large wooden board approximately 4 feet square. The base of the subtlety is a representation of a circular hall. The round table itself, in the legendary form that Edward III had been promoting since the early 1340s, with his own attempt to revive the order at Windsor. The walls of the circular hall are made of pale sugar paste, with decorative arches carved into them. The roof is made of pastry, gilded with the egg and saffron glaze that the medieval kitchen used to give pastry a gold appearance. Inside the circular hall, around a representation of the round table itself, a flat disc of darker sugar paste, set on a raised pedestal in the centre of the structure. The figures of King Arthur and the 12 principal knights of his court are arranged in their traditional places. Each figure is perhaps 6 inches high, worked in tinted marzipan, with the armour and clothing of each knight rendered in the careful detail that the master pastry cook is capable of producing. King Arthur sits at the centre of the table, with his gold crown on his head. Around him, in the arrangement that the medieval Arthurian tradition required, are arranged Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, Galahad, and the other principal knights. The symbolic message of the subtlety is, by the cultural understanding of the assembled company, immediately clear. Edward III, by hosting his Christmas court at Windsor, the very castle at which he had attempted, 14 years earlier, to revive the Round Table, and by serving his captive kings at his high table, is making a claim about himself. He is the new King Arthur. The assembled company at his Christmas feast is the new Round Table. The captive kings of France and Scotland are the defeated enemies whose presence at his court is the outward demonstration of his Arthurian destiny. The whole subtlety, in its elaborate sugar paste construction, is a political statement of the most carefully calibrated kind. The senior pages bring the subtlety into the hall on a great silver gilt salver, carried at shoulder height between 4 of them. The assembled company falls silent as the procession enters. The minstrels in the gallery shift to a particular piece of ceremonial music, slow, stately, in the solemn style that the entry of a major subtlety required. The salver is borne the length of the hall and set, with careful precision, on a dedicated side table that has been placed in front of the high table. For the purpose, the whole assembled company can see the subtlety from their places at the lower tables. Edward III, at the high table, looks at the subtlety with the careful pleasure of a host who is seeing his own intended message reflected back to him in 3-dimensional sugar form. He gestures, in the ceremonial way of the period, to the senior page who is in charge of the subtlety. The senior page steps forward. He recites from memory the verse that has been composed for the subtlety, a short Latin epigram, perhaps 4 lines long, in the elegant ceremonial Latin of the senior royal clerks who composed such things, declaring the theme of the subtlety and the message it is intended to carry. The assembled company listens. The Latin verse ends. The company applauds, in the decorous way that the period considered appropriate, with the gentle striking of the palms together that the medieval court used as its equivalent of the modern applause. The subtlety has, by the custom of the period, served its principal purpose.
It will not be eaten now. It will remain on the side table for the rest of the feast, as a decorative centerpiece for the assembled company to look at and admire. At the end of the evening, the senior pages will dismantle it carefully, and the edible portions, the marzipan figures of the knights, the sugar walls of the circular hall, the gilded pastry roof, will be distributed among the senior guests as a particular souvenir of the evening. The entrance of the subtlety has marked the end of the first course. The trenchers in front of every guest are removed by the household pages.
Fresh trenchers are placed in front of every guest. The cups are refilled. A brief pause in the proceedings allows the assembled company to converse, to walk down to the central fire to warm their hands, to make whatever social adjustments the opening of the feast has called for.
I want to use this pause to spend a moment on the entertainments that have been provided for the evening, because the entertainments, the people, and the performances that occupy the intervals between the courses are part of the texture of the medieval royal feast that the modern reader most often imagines incorrectly. The principal entertainment throughout the evening has been the music of the royal minstrels in the gallery above the screen's passage. The minstrels, perhaps a dozen of them, are the senior musicians of the royal household.
They are professional musicians, with the careful training and the extensive repertoire that the royal court of the mid-14th century required. The harp in the portable form that the medieval period had developed for indoor performance. The rebec, a bowed-stringed instrument, the ancestor of the modern violin. The recorder, a wind instrument in several different sizes. The shawm, a louder reed instrument used for ceremonial fanfares, and the tabor, drum, used to keep time. The musicians, throughout the evening, will play a carefully selected program, the ceremonial fanfares that mark the entries of the courses, the dance music that will accompany the dancing later in the evening, the quieter background music that fills the intervals between the courses and the moments of conversation around the tables. In addition to the music, however, there are other performers who have been brought into the hall for the evening. There are jugglers, itinerant performers who travel from court to court with the repertoire of juggling tricks and tumbling acts and feats of physical dexterity that the period had developed. There are mummers, costumed performers who will, later in the evening, perform a mumming play in the tradition that the English court particularly favoured at Christmas. There are tumblers, acrobats who will perform between the courses in the space between the long tables in the body of the hall, with the assembled company watching from their seats on either side. There are dwarves of the king's household persons who, by the tradition that the medieval royal courts maintained from the late 13th century onwards, were employed at court partly as servants and partly as entertainers, and who would, in the intervals between the courses, perform comic interludes that the assembled company found entertaining. There are minstrel poets reciters who will declaim, in the intervals between the courses, the poems and the romances of the medieval secular tradition that the period particularly enjoyed. I want to spend a moment on the mumming play that will be performed later in the evening, because the mumming play is one of the most distinctively English forms of medieval entertainment, and the particular play to be performed at the Christmas feast, 1358, is one of the cultural moments of the entire evening that gives the occasion its particular flavour. A mumming play, in the medieval English tradition, is a short dramatic performance, usually about 20 minutes long, performed by a company of costumed actors, with the traditional features of disguise, ritual combat, and symbolic resurrection that mark the genre. The actors are masked or otherwise disguised, sometimes with the elaborate animal masks that the medieval costumiers had developed, sometimes with the decorative cloth costumes that represented allegorical figures. The play follows a traditional pattern: an introduction by a narrator, a ritual combat between two of the masked figures, the death of one of the combatants, the arrival of a doctor figure who restores the dead combatant to life, and a closing celebration in which all the figures join in a dance. The symbolism of the mumming play, by the judgment of the modern scholars who have studied the tradition, is the seasonal symbolism of midwinter, the death of the old year, the resurrection of the new year, the particular celebration of the turning point of the calendar that Christmas Day itself represents. The play, in the cultural memory of the period, is the particular form of entertainment that Christmas Day requires. The mumming play that will be performed later in the evening at Windsor 1358 is, by the arrangement of the household, the traditional St. George play, the particular version of the mumming tradition that featured St. George, the patron saint of England, in his combat with the dragon and his subsequent celebration. The play has been rehearsed for several weeks by the company of household players who have been engaged for the Christmas court. They will perform it in the space between the lower tables, with the assembled company watching from their places at the long tables, with the great fire in the central hearth providing the warm, flickering backlight that the dramatic effect requires. The guests, when they are watching the mumming play later in the evening, will be participating in a cultural tradition that has roots going back, in some form, perhaps to the pre-Christian midwinter rituals of the British Isles. The tradition will continue in various forms through the medieval period into the early modern period, and on into the modern era, with various village mumming plays still being performed in parts of rural England in the 21st century, in the traditional way that the medieval period had bequeathed. The whole evening is, in the cumulative effect, not a continuous meal, but a layered theatrical entertainment of which the food itself is only one component. The medieval royal feast was, in the structural sense, closer to a modern combined dinner and theatrical performance, an evening at the opera that included a meal, than to a modern dinner party in which the meal is the only event. The senior household servants, during the interval between the first and second courses, are setting up for the next stage of the evening. The tumblers come into the space between the lower tables. They perform for perhaps 10 minutes an elaborate routine of acrobatic feats, somersaults, handstands, human pyramids, feats of balance involving wooden poles and spinning plates. The assembled company watches with the appreciative attention of an audience watching a familiar but skilled performance. The tumblers conclude their routine with a bow toward the high table. The company applauds, the tumblers withdraw. The procession of the second course is being formed. The second course, in the medieval royal feast, was generally smaller in scale than the first course, but more varied in its composition. The first course had concentrated on the great roasted meats: the boar's head, the swan, the peacock, the haunch of venison, the great pies. The second course shifts the emphasis to the smaller fowl and to the fish dishes that the medieval kitchen treated as a separate category. The procession enters in the same way as the first course, led by the master of the household with his white wand of office, followed by the pages bearing the dishes. The dishes of the second course include several roasted fowl, pheasants, partridges, woodcocks, snipes, the smaller game birds that the medieval kitchen prepared, with a careful attention to the differences between the species. There are several roasted suckling pigs, young pigs, perhaps 2 months old, roasted whole and presented with their bodies on the salver, with roasted apples in their mouths in the traditional decorative manner. There are several great fish pike, bream, large salmon, the fresh water fish that had been brought up from the royal fish ponds and from the Thames, each fish presented whole on its salver, with the decorative sauces that the medieval period favoured for the fish dishes. That was one of the signature dishes of the medieval royal kitchen. The carving and serving of the second course follows the same pattern as the first. The senior carver works at the high table, carving each dish with the particular technique appropriate to the particular bird or fish. The lower tables are served by the lower carvers. The cups are refilled. The conversation continues. I want to spend a moment, during this second course, on the conversation at the high table itself, because the conversation between Edward III and his 2 captive kings is one of the most extraordinary aspects of the entire evening, and the record of what such conversations were like has, in the surviving chronicles of the period, given us a glimpse into the human texture of the medieval royal court at this extraordinary moment. By all contemporary accounts, the relationship between Edward III, King John of France, and King David of Scotland was one of genuine personal warmth, a cultivated chivalric friendship between 3 crowned heads who, despite the political circumstances of the captivity, were treating each other with the elaborate courtesy that the medieval chivalric tradition required. King John of France, in particular, had developed a close personal friendship with Edward III during the 2 years of his captivity. He was given, by Edward, his own apartments at the Savoy Palace in London. He was given his own income, the substantial sum of £3,000 a year, for the maintenance of his personal household. He was given the liberty to receive visitors from France, to correspond with his family, to commission works of art from the English court painters, to hunt and to hawk in the royal forests, to attend mass at his own pleasure. The terms of his captivity were, by the standards of the period, extraordinarily generous. He was, in essence, an honoured royal guest of the English court, with the single qualification that he was not allowed to leave England until the question of his ransom had been resolved. The negotiations for the ransom were, in 1358, ongoing. The eventual figure, when finally agreed in 1360, would be 3 million gold crowns, the largest single ransom in medieval European history. But in 1358, with the negotiations still in progress, John was simply a royal guest of Edward's court, conducting the elaborate social life of any senior medieval royal figure of the period, with the exception that he could not, for the moment, go home. I want to spend a moment on King John II of France himself, because his personality is one of the particularly interesting features of the company at the high table in Windsor on Christmas evening 1358. John II of France, sometimes called Jean le Bon, John the Good, in the French historical tradition that has come down to us, was born in 1319, the son of King Philip VI of France and his wife Joan of Burgundy. He was 39 years old in December 1358, slightly older than the Black Prince, slightly younger than Edward III. He had succeeded his father as King of France in 1350, 8 years before our feast. He had spent most of those 8 years conducting the war with England that he had inherited from his father, with the result, in September 1356, that he had been captured at Poitiers and had spent the subsequent 2 years and 3 months in his captivity in England. He was, by every contemporary account, a man of considerable personal courage and considerable chivalric accomplishment. He had fought at Poitiers with the personal valour that the period particularly admired, refusing to flee when his army had collapsed around him, fighting on foot with his personal axe in the final stages of the battle when the English had closed in on his position, surrendering only when the impossibility of his situation had become absolutely clear. He had borne his captivity, in the years since, with the dignified composure that the medieval chivalric tradition expected of a captured king. He had not complained, he had not sulked, he had not, by every account, allowed his personal feelings about his predicament to interfere with his public conduct as a royal guest of the English court. The result was that, by 1358, John had developed something approaching a genuine personal friendship with his captor. He hunted with Edward III. He hawked with Edward III. He commissioned, as we have already mentioned, works of art from the English court painters, including, in 1358, a particular illuminated manuscript that survives in modern collections, decorated with the personal devices of both the French king and his English host, in a gesture of the cultural bond that had developed between them. He participated, as an honoured guest, in the major court ceremonies of the English royal year: the Garter feast at St. George's Day, the Christmas court at Windsor, the Whitsun celebrations, the various royal weddings and christenings that the period required. He was, in the cultural sense, a member of the English royal court for the duration of his captivity. The tragedy of his subsequent life, that he would, after his release in 1360 and the partial payment of his ransom, voluntarily return to England in 1364 when one of his hostage sons escaped from English custody, in the gesture of personal honour that the medieval chivalric tradition admired but that even his contemporaries found extraordinary, and that he would die in London at the Savoy Palace shortly after his second voluntary captivity began, at the age of 44, was not, of course, visible in 1358. On the evening of the Christmas feast, he was simply a royal guest at the high table, conversing in his elegant medieval French with his English hosts, enjoying the food and the wine and the music of the evening in the elaborate chivalric way that the period required. King David of Scotland was in a similar position. He had been Edward's prisoner for 12 years, since his capture at Neville's Cross in 1346. His terms of captivity had been comparatively comfortable from the beginning. He, too, had been given his own apartments for some years at the Tower of London, more recently at Windsor Castle in Hampshire and at Windsor itself. He, too, had been given the freedom to participate in the social and ceremonial life of the English court. He had, by 1358, been formally released. His ransom of £66,600 had been agreed in 1357, payable in instalments over a period of years, but he had returned to the English court for the Christmas feast at his own choice, partly because the personal friendship with Edward III had become a real one over the years of his captivity, and partly because the political ceremony of his attendance at Edward's Christmas court was a gesture of friendship between the two crowns that he was choosing to make. I want to spend a moment, similarly, on King David II of Scotland. David was the son of Robert the Bruce, the great Scottish king who had won the Battle of Bannockburn against Edward III's grandfather Edward II in 1314 and had secured by that victory the independence of Scotland from English overlordship. David had inherited the Scottish throne in 1329 at the age of 5 when his father died. He had spent most of his childhood in France, sent there for safety during the civil wars that followed Robert the Bruce's death, and had returned to Scotland in his late teens to take up the personal rule of his kingdom. He had been 22 years old when he was captured at Neville's Cross in 1346, having led a Scottish army into northern England in the traditional Scottish gambit of opening a second front against England while the main English army was occupied in France. His captivity, like John's, had been generous. He had been treated as an honoured royal guest. He had been given liberty to communicate with his Scottish subjects, to receive Scottish visitors, to commission works on his behalf. He had, like John, developed a genuine personal friendship with Edward III over the years of his captivity. He was, by 1358, 34 years old, with the bearing of a man who had spent most of his adult life in the elaborate ceremonial environment of a senior royal court, even if that court had been the court of his captor rather than his own, the tragedy of David's subsequent life. That he would die in 1371 at the age of 46, without a male heir, leading to the succession of the Stuart dynasty in Scotland, was not, of course, visible in 1358. On the evening of the Christmas feast, he was simply another royal guest at the high table, conversing in his Scottish accented English with his hosts, enjoying the food and the wine and the music in the same elaborate chivalric way that John was. The conversation at the high table during the second course of the Christmas feast, 1358, ranges, by the account of the chronicles, across the subjects that any senior royal company of the period would have discussed: the details of recent military campaigns, the gossip of the European royal courts, the theological questions that the senior bishops at the high table were always inclined to introduce, the literary discussions about the chivalric romances that the period particularly favoured, the small practical questions of the royal hunt, the quality of the venison they were currently eating, the small breeding programme that Edward had recently introduced for his royal stags, the small techniques of hawking that the senior nobles of the company particularly favoured. The whole atmosphere of the conversation, by every contemporary account, was one of genuine ease and genuine friendship, the elaborate chivalric courtesy of the medieval royal court being conducted on the high dais of the Great Hall at Windsor, between three crowned heads who genuinely liked each other, and who were, despite the political circumstances, enjoying each other's company. The second course concludes, after about an hour, with the entry of the second subtlety. This subtlety, smaller than the first, depicts a stag at bay, the traditional medieval image of the hunted stag standing at the edge of a stream, with the hounds bayed around it, worked in the same combination of sugar paste and marzipan and pastry that had produced the first subtlety. The verse that accompanies it, recited again by the senior page in charge, is a brief reflection on the virtues of the chase in the genteel allegorical style that the period favoured. The assembled company applauds. The subtlety is set on the side table beside the first. The trenchers are changed again, the cups are refilled. A second brief pause allows for further conversation, further entertainment from the dwarves and the minstrels, further small movement around the hall. The third course is being prepared. The third course, in the medieval royal feast, was the course at which the entire scale of the meal began to wind down. The dishes of the third course were smaller in size and lighter in their character. Delicate pastries, candied fruits, small specialty dishes designed to provide a pleasing conclusion to the principal eating of the evening, rather than to add further substantial calories. There were small custards, sweetened with sugar and flavoured with rosewater. There were small tarts of dates and figs and dried apricots. There were small pastries filled with the spiced fruit and nut mixtures that the medieval kitchen called by various names. There were candied fruits, whole peaches and pears that had been preserved in sugar syrup, presented in decorative arrangements on silver plates. There were cheeses, fine cheeses from the royal estates, presented with small honeys and decorative accompaniments. The carving of the third course was less elaborate than first two. Most of the dishes did not require the same theatrical attention. The serving was lighter and faster. The conversation continued around the high table and the lower tables. The cups continued to be refilled. The minstrels continued to play. The third subtlety, when it arrived at the end of the third course, depicted a Christmas nativity scene, the traditional medieval image of the Holy Family in the stable at Bethlehem. with the shepherds and the magi and the star above, all worked in the tinted sugar paste and the small marzipan figures of the medieval pastry cook's repertoire. It was, by the judgment of the assembled company, the most beautiful of the three subtleties of the evening, a quiet devotional image, in keeping with the religious meaning of Christmas Day, brought into the hall after the principal eating of the evening had concluded, as a reminder to the company of the religious occasion that the entire feast was, at one level, a celebration of. The company received the third subtlety in the reverent silence that the subject matter required. The senior page's verse on this occasion was a Latin hymn, a brief Christmas hymn in the traditional liturgical Latin of the period, sung rather than recited, that the senior page knew by heart from his clerical training. The company listened. The hymn ended. The senior bishops at the high table made the small sign of the cross. The subtlety was set on the side table beside the others. The principal eating of the evening was now over, but the evening itself, by the reckoning of the medieval royal feast, was very far from finished. The custom of the period, after the third course had been concluded, was the service of the hippocras. Hippocras was, by the medieval understanding, the drink that brought a great feast to its proper close. To remove the spice particles and produce a small, clear, deeply aromatic, sweet, hot drink. It was named after the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, in the medieval understanding that the spiced wine had medicinal properties, that it aided the digestion of the substantial meal that had just been consumed, that it warmed the body in the cold of a winter evening, that it produced the genial warmth in the body that the medieval medical theory associated with good health. The hippocras at the Christmas feast, 1358, is brought into the hall in great silver gilt jugs, carried by the senior cupbearers of the household. The cupbearers move the length of the high table, pouring the hot fragrant drink into each guest's silver gilt cup. The lower tables receive the same hippocras in the same quantities in their pewter cups. With the hippocras come the final accompaniments of the evening, small wafers of fine sweet pastry, baked in the wafery, in the intricate decorative shapes that the medieval wafer maker had developed, candied spices, then decorative arrangements. The company drinks the hippocras slowly. The aromatic hot drink, after the substantial eating of the previous 3 hours, has the particular effect that the medieval understanding had attributed to it. It produces in the company that drinks it a genial, warm relaxation, a gentle slowing of the pace of the conversation, a feeling that the work of the evening has been concluded and that the time has arrived for the gentler entertainments that will conclude the night. The minstrels in the gallery shift at this point to the dance music that the period associated with the closing entertainments of a great feast. By the custom of the period, the senior guests would now leave their seats and would, in the space between the long tables and around the central hearth, perform the dances of the medieval court. The dances were not, by modern standards, particularly athletic. They were the stately courtly dances of the mid-14th century, with the careful steps and the small ceremonial gestures and the elaborate small bows that the period required. The bass dance, the principal courtly dance of the period, involved the company forming up in pairs with the man on the left and the lady on the right, and proceeding through the small repeating sequence of steps that the dance required. The carol, a simpler dance performed in a circle with the dancers holding hands, was particularly associated with the Christmas season and was almost certain to be performed at any Christmas feast. Edward III himself, by every contemporary account, was a keen and skilled dancer. He would, on this evening, lead the dancing himself, taking the senior position in the basse danse with Queen Philippa as his partner, and would, in the small ceremonial way that the medieval court favoured, encourage the other senior figures of the company to participate. The captive kings, by the account of the chronicles, also participated in the dancing, King John of France, being, by every account, a particularly accomplished dancer in the French court tradition, and being given the honour of leading several of the dances himself in the company of the senior English ladies. The dancing continues, with intervals for further hippocras and further small wafers and further small entertainments from the minstrels and the tumblers and the dwarves of the king's household for perhaps 2 hours. By about 10 o'clock in the evening, the principal company has begun to slow.
I want to spend a moment, before we leave the Great Hall, on the final hour of the feast, the period from about 10 o'clock to about midnight, because the small atmosphere of the final hour of a great medieval feast was one of the particular pleasures of the entire institution. The high table, by 10 o'clock, has thinned out. The senior bishops, who have responsibilities for the Christmas Day services, have already withdrawn to their lodgings to rest before the midnight mass that they will conduct in the royal chapel.
Several of the more senior nobles, who have travelled long distances to attend the feast, have similarly withdrawn. The royal children, the younger members of the royal family who are still living at court, were taken away earlier in the evening by their nurses and governesses to be put to bed. The principal figures still at the high table, by 10 o'clock, are Edward III himself, Queen Philippa, the Black Prince, the two captive kings, and perhaps 4 or 5 of the most senior nobles whose position requires them to remain in the king's company until the king himself withdraws. The lower tables have similarly thinned. The most junior of the invited guests have already left, in the small ways that the medieval court permitted. They have walked, in small groups, down to the guest lodgings in the lower ward of the castle, where their personal servants have prepared the small chambers in which they will spend the night. The senior nobles at the lower tables, those who are remaining for the final hour of the feast, have moved closer to the central fire, where they have arranged themselves in informal groups on small wooden benches that have been brought from the lower tables for the purpose, with their cups of hippocras in their hands and their quiet conversations conducted in the warm flickering light of the great central hearth. The atmosphere of the great hall in this final hour is the particular cosy atmosphere that any large gathering acquires in its late stages. The quieter conversations, the intimate small groupings, the shared sense of having been part of a great occasion that is now drawing to its close. The candles around the hall have by this point burned down considerably. The tall tapers in the iron candelabra are now perhaps half their original height, and the quality of the light has dimmed correspondingly.
The great fire in the central hearth has settled. The high orange flames of the early evening have given way to the deeper red glow of the accumulated coals, with the occasional new log being added by a page to keep the warmth at the level the company requires.
The minstrels in the gallery have by this point shifted again to the quiet melodic music that the period favoured for the closing hours of any evening, played at a reduced volume, with the instrumentation reduced to perhaps 3 of the quieter instruments. By 11 o'clock, the final fanfare is sounded. Edward III rises from his place at the high table. Queen Philippa rises beside him. The Black Prince rises. The captive kings rise. The senior nobles rise. The whole assembled company in the body of the hall, those who are still present, rises in response. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who has remained for the final ceremonial moment, pronounces the final blessing of the evening, a brief Latin formula asking for God's protection over the company through the approaching night. The company says, Amen. The Archbishop makes the gesture of blessing. The royal party turns and walks, in the reverse order of its entry several hours earlier, the length of the dais and out through the door at the eastern end of the hall, back to the royal apartments, where the senior royal figures will spend the night. The captive kings are escorted by senior officers of the household to their own guest apartments in the upper ward. The senior nobles who are remaining for the night are escorted by household pages to the guest lodgings that have been prepared for them. The feast is over. Within an hour, the great hall is empty. The household servants, who by the custom of the period have not eaten properly themselves throughout the long working day, and who will now have their own late supper in the kitchens before they go to bed, are clearing the hall. The trenchers are being collected from every place at every table. The soaked bread, soaked with the juices and sauces of the entire evening, being carefully gathered into large wicker baskets that will be taken before dawn the following morning to the castle gates and given to the poor of the surrounding parishes. The cups are being collected and washed. The knives and spoons are being collected. The tablecloths are being folded. The subtleties on the side table are being carefully dismantled. with their edible portions being divided up among the senior household servants as the traditional perquisite of the kitchen staff at the close of any great feast. The candles, one by one, are being snuffed by a page with a brass candle snuffer on a long wooden handle. The great fire in the central hearth is being banked down, covered with a layer of ash, in the traditional manner, to keep it smouldering through the night so that it can be quickly revived in the morning. By midnight, the great hall, which had, 2 hours earlier, been the scene of one of the most splendid royal feasts in 14th century Europe, is dark and quiet. The tapestries on the walls are barely visible in the dim red glow of the banked fire. The empty long tables stretch away into the shadows. The high table on the dais, with its cloth of gold still in place but its silver-gilt cups and plates already cleared away, is the only sign that the evening's events have happened at all. Outside, in the December cold, the castle settles into the quiet of the late winter night. In the lodgings throughout the upper and lower wards, the senior guests are preparing for sleep. Their personal servants have warmed their beds with copper warming pans full of hot coals. They have laid out the nightclothes. They have prepared the small basins of hot water for the final washing.
The guests, in the small ceremonial way of the period, are conducting the small evening prayers that the medieval Christian tradition required, before climbing into their small, heavily curtained beds and drawing the bed curtains around them against the cold of the night.
In the royal apartments at the eastern end of the upper ward, the king and queen have similarly retired. The Black Prince has retired. The two captive kings, David of Scotland in his apartments in one part of the castle, John of France in his apartments in another, have retired. The great Christmas feast at Windsor in 1358 is, in the complete sense, over. I want to spend the last part of our evening together on what survived. And was succeeded on the English throne by his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, the son of the Black Prince. Queen Philippa had predeceased him in 1369. King John of France was finally released from his extended captivity in 1360, 2 years after our feast, when the Treaty of Bretigny set the terms of his ransom. He was unable to raise the entire ransom from his French subjects. By the extraordinary act of personal honour that the medieval chivalric tradition admired, he voluntarily returned to England in 1364 to resume his captivity in his son's place, and died in London at the Savoy Palace shortly afterwards, in April 1364, at the age of 44. King David of Scotland survived until 1371, when he died at Edinburgh Castle at the age of 46. The Great Hall at Windsor, the physical room in which the entire feast we have been imagining took place, was in the subsequent rebuilding of Windsor by later kings, eventually replaced by the St. George's Hall that the modern visitor to Windsor still sees. The original Edward III Hall stood until the late 17th century, when it was rebuilt by Charles II in the Baroque style that his reign favoured. The Charles II Hall was itself rebuilt by George IV in the early 19th century in the Gothic revival style that George IV favoured. The George IV Hall was largely destroyed in the Great Windsor Castle fire of 1992 and was rebuilt in the years immediately afterwards in a careful modern reconstruction of George IV's Gothic revival design. The room you can visit at Windsor today, therefore, is not the room we have been describing. It is a late 20th century reconstruction of an early 19th century rebuilding of a late 17th century replacement of the original. But the patch of ground on which the room stands is the same patch of ground. The dimensions of the present hall are roughly original Edward III Hall. The position of the dais at the eastern end is in the same place. If you stand, today, in the St. George's Hall at Windsor on a quiet weekday afternoon, with the tourists passing through and the guides giving their commentary, you can stand on the patch of stone-flagged floor on which Edward III stood at the high table on Christmas evening 1358 and pronounce the blessing over his assembled company. The whole subsequent history of the room, in the way of these things, is layered over the original moment in the careful way that British architectural tradition tends to layer its historical sites. The Order of the Garter, which Edward III had founded in 1348, 10 years before our feast, survived him and continues to this day. By 2026, the Order of the Garter is the most senior order of chivalry in the British honours system. Its membership is limited by the terms of the original founding statutes to the monarch and 24 other knights companions, plus a number of supernumerary royal and foreign members.
The Garter Day ceremony is held every June at Windsor Castle, in the same St George's Chapel that Edward III had begun to build in the 1350s, with the assembled knights wearing the blue garter robes and the elaborate small ceremonial regalia that the order has worn, with minor variations, for the past 6.5 centuries. The order is, in the institutional sense, the direct continuation of the small chivalric institution that Edward III was promoting at his Christmas court in 1358. The kitchens of Windsor in their original form are, like the Great Hall, no longer extant. The kitchen complex was rebuilt several times over the following centuries, and the present royal kitchens at Windsor occupy a Victorian building. But the archaeological evidence that survives from medieval royal kitchens elsewhere, particularly from Hampton Court, where the Tudor kitchens have been preserved in remarkable completeness, and from various smaller royal manors of the period where the kitchen buildings have been excavated, gives us, in the modern understanding, a detailed picture of how such kitchens worked. The great hearths, the spit roasting equipment, the pastry ovens, the spiceries, all of these have been carefully studied and reconstructed by the modern historians of medieval cuisine, and the picture we now have of how a feast, like the Christmas feast of 1358, was actually prepared, is more detailed than at any previous moment in the historiography. The spice trade that supplied the medieval royal kitchen has of course transformed in the subsequent centuries. The overland routes that brought pepper from Malabar to England in 1358 were displaced after the late 15th century Portuguese discovery of the sea route around Africa by the direct sea trade. The monopoly position of the Italian city-states in the European spice trade was broken. The prices of the principal spices by the 17th century had fallen to a fraction of their 14th century levels. By 2026, pepper is of course a common condiment available in any supermarket for a trivial sum. The cultural meaning of the spice, which had been, in 1358, one of the most expensive and most carefully measured ingredients in any royal kitchen, has been completely lost in the intervening centuries. But the overland route that the peppercorns travelled in 1358, across the Indian Ocean, through the Persian Gulf, across Arabia, into the eastern Mediterranean, across the Mediterranean to Venice, across the Alps and through France to England, is, in the historical sense, the route that the modern world has been built on top of. The custom of giving the trenchers from a great feast to the poor at the castle gates, which had been one of the characteristic features of the medieval royal feast, survived in various forms into the early modern period. By the 18th century, the practice had largely disappeared. The charitable distributions of the modern British royal household are conducted on different principles, through different institutions, with different arrangements. Is a feature of the medieval royal feast that the modern reader sometimes fails to appreciate. There is something, I think, about the institutions of the past that the modern reader sometimes finds genuinely strange. The medieval royal feast, with its boars' heads and its swans, served in their feathers, and its sugar sculptures of King Arthur's Round Table, and its captive kings sitting at the high table beside their captor, is by the measures of modern hospitality a small, specifically alien institution. It does not closely resemble any modern dinner party. It does not closely resemble any modern state banquet. It does not closely resemble any modern Christmas celebration. It is, in the cultural sense, an institution from a different world. But what the medieval royal feast had, what it had in a concentration that the modern reader can still recognize even across the 6.5 centuries that separate us from it, was the quality of theatrical conviviality. It was a performance. It was a shared experience of the company of fellow human beings gathered in a warm room on a cold winter night, eating elaborate food and drinking wine and listening to music
and watching entertainments and conducting the elaborate ceremonial of an institution that had been refined over generations to produce a particular kind of pleasure in the assembled company. The pleasure was not, in the modern sense, a private pleasure. The medieval royal feast was not designed to make any individual guest feel small, specifically comfortable in the way that a modern dinner party tries to make its individual guests feel comfortable. It was designed to make the company as a whole experience the shared theatrical event of the evening. The pleasure was a collective pleasure, the pleasure of having been part of the assembled company, of having witnessed the subtleties and the carving rituals and the entries of the courses, of having been one of the 200 people present at the occasion that in the cultural memory of the period would be talked about for years afterwards. That kind of collective theatrical pleasure is, in the way that all such things slowly are, less easily available in our own moment. The modern reader can still, in some sense, experience something like it at a great wedding, at a state occasion, at the particularly successful Christmas dinner of a large family that has gathered from many places to be together. But the intensity of the institution we have been describing, the sense that the entire evening was a deliberately constructed theatrical event, with every element planned and executed by trained professionals, conducted in a room that had been prepared for the purpose by hundreds of staff over the course of weeks, is, in the modern sense, much harder to find. That is one of the reasons I think that the medieval royal feast continues to capture the modern imagination. It was, at its best, a genuine work of theatrical art, an art form that has, in the modern world, no precise descendant, but whose pleasures are still, in the imagination, accessible to anyone who is willing to spend an evening picturing themselves in the candlelit hall at Windsor on Christmas evening 1358, with the great fire burning in the central hearth and the aroma of roasted boar and spiced wine and wood smoke filling the warm air of the room. And so, as our evening at the great Christmas feast at Windsor draws toward its close, I want to bring you back, slowly, to where you actually are. We have been, in our imagination, in the great hall of Windsor Castle, on the evening of the 25th of December 1358. We have stood in the lower ward of the castle, as the senior guests arrived in the cold of the late afternoon. We have walked down to the kitchens and watched the cooks at work in the hours before the feast. The great fires, the spits turning, the pies in the pastry ovens, the spices being measured out from the spicery cupboards. We have come up to the great hall and seen the tapestries and the candles and the great central fire and the high table on the dais with its cloth of gold and its great salt cellar. We have watched Edward III enter the hall with Queen Philippa on his arm and the Black Prince behind him and the captive kings of France and Scotland in the senior places at the high table. We have seen the boar's head brought in, with its glazed gold colour and its roasted apple in its mouth and its wreath of bay and rosemary around it. We have watched the senior carver perform his work. We have seen the swan and the peacock and the great pies and the haunch of venison with the frumenty. We have watched the subtleties brought in between the courses, the round table of King Arthur, the stag at bay, the Christmas nativity. We have heard the minstrels playing in the gallery above the screen's passage. We have watched the dancing in the space between the long tables. We have drunk the hippocras at the close. We have watched the candles being snuffed and the great fire being banked down for the night. We have, in the small, careful, imaginative way that an evening like this permits, been present at the Christmas feast at Windsor in 1358 for a long evening. The hour in the world that you and I actually inhabit is also late, perhaps, or early. It has been a long evening. You have been listening for some time. The room around you, wherever you are, has its own particular small details that the script does not know about. Your own light, your own blanket, your own quiet. I hope that the picture of the great hall of the candles, the tapestries, the central fire, the long oak tables, the human traffic of an institution that is now 6.5 centuries gone, has been a useful one to spend a few hours with. There is something I keep finding about these small, great institutions of theatrical conviviality at the height of their period. The medieval royal feast was not the first form of human public eating, and it was not the last. It was a cultural moment that produced, in its own way, an extraordinary refinement of an institution that human beings have been practicing in some form for as long as there have been human beings. The shared meal among a company of friends and equals and rivals and dependents, conducted in the warm glow of a fire on a cold winter night, with food and drink and music and conversation and ceremony, in a room that has been prepared for the purpose by hands other than the diner's own.
The men and women who came to Windsor for Edward III's Christmas court in 1358 did not know that they were participating in an institution whose particular form would, within 2 centuries, begin to disappear. They thought they were, simply, attending the King's Christmas feast. They were, in the way of all the most consequential cultural moments, doing exactly what they thought they were doing, and, in the doing of it, producing something much larger than they could have imagined.
If you have enjoyed this evening, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from.
There are more stories like this one. More cozy institutions of past centuries reconstructed in detail for an evening's listening. If you know someone who loves history, or who finds comfort in the slow, long-form pleasure of an evening recreated in detail, please share this with them. There is one last small thing I want to leave you with before we close.
If you ever happen to find yourself at Windsor, walking up the hill from the river, through the gates of the castle, into the upper ward where the great hall stood and stands, you can do a pilgrimage that will take you, in the way that the careful walker through a historical site can take such pilgrimages very nearly into the room we have been describing. Stand in the present St. George's Hall on a quiet weekday afternoon. Look at the dimensions of the room. Look at the position of the dais at the eastern end. Try to imagine, behind the modern reconstruction of the Gothic Revival reconstruction of the Baroque reconstruction of the original room, the great fire burning in the central hearth, the tapestries hanging on the walls, the long oak tables stretching down both sides, the candles in their tall iron candelabra, the high table on the dais with its cloth of gold, the assembled company in their fine costumes. The buildings have been rebuilt many times, but the patch of ground is the same. The stone-flagged floor on which Edward III stood on Christmas evening 1358 is, in the ultimate physical sense, still there 6.5 centuries below the accumulated layers of subsequent rebuilding, but still there. You can also, if your pilgrimage takes you in the particular direction, walk the short distance from the Great Hall to the neighbouring chapel of St. George, the royal chapel that Edward III had begun to build in the 1350s, whose present form is the late 15th century perpendicular Gothic building that Edward IV completed and that the subsequent kings of England added to over the subsequent centuries. The chapel is, by 2026, still the home of the Order of the Garter, the institution that Edward III had founded 10 years before our feast, and that, in some symbolic way, was the permanent institutional shape that his Christmas feast was a particular celebration of. If you stand in the stalls of the Knights of the Garter, with the small heraldic banners of the current members hanging above your head, and the small carved misericords beneath the seats, you can, if you concentrate, feel the cumulative weight of the cultural tradition that has been continuous on the patch of ground for 6.5 centuries. That is the way that the past survives in the great houses of England. The buildings come down, the institutions transform, the customs change, but the patches of ground and the descendant institutions that grew from them, and the cultural memory of what happened on them, outlast everything else, and provide for the careful walker who knows what to look for, the traces by which a vanished world can still, after 6.5 centuries, be very nearly touched. If you do that walk on a winter afternoon, with the light fading early through the Gothic windows of the present hall, you can, if you concentrate, almost hear the minstrels playing in the gallery above the screen's passage, the fanfare of the trumpets announcing the entry of the boar's head, the solemn voice of the senior page reciting the Latin verse for the King Arthur's subtlety, the quiet conversations of the senior nobles around the central fire in the late hours of the evening. The imaginative work of standing in those places, on those patches of English ground, is, in the way of these things, the pleasure that a careful reader of history can still, in 2026, enjoy. The medieval royal feast was, in the way of these things, one of the most splendid institutions of public hospitality that the human imagination has ever produced. The particular evening we have spent together, the Christmas feast at Windsor in 1358, with Edward III at the high table and his captive kings at his side, and the great fire burning in the central hearth, and the subtleties being borne in to the applause of the assembled company, was in its own moment one of the particularly fine examples of that institution. I hope that in our few small hours together tonight we have managed in our imagination to spend some of its pleasant evening as if we ourselves had been guests at one of the lower tables, watching the high table from a small respectful distance, listening to the music drifting down from the gallery, eating the carved venison with frumenty, and drinking the Bordeaux red wine, and watching the procession of the subtleties past our table. The world that produced the medieval royal feast, the cultural moment of 14th century European chivalry, with its captive kings and its sugar sculptures, and its boars' heads, and its carving rituals, and its long winter evenings in candlelit halls, has, in the way that all such cultural moments eventually do, passed away. The institutions that succeeded it, the Tudor banquet, the Baroque court spectacle, the Georgian state dinner, the Victorian formal banquet, the modern state visit, have each, in their particular way, taken some part of what the medieval feast did and refined it for their own cultural needs. None of them, by the cumulative judgment of the historical record, ever produced quite the particular combination of theatrical spectacle and chivalric ceremony and elaborate culinary craft and warm convivial pleasure that the medieval royal feast at the height of its tradition produced. The institution we have spent the evening with was, in its own moment, unique. It was also, in the way of these things, the source from which all the subsequent forms of European royal entertainment ultimately descended. For now, sleep well. Good night.